The night had been uneventful at first, the kind of quiet evening that made the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant drone of traffic on the nearby highway feel like the only sounds in the world. It was late September in a small suburban town in the Midwest, the sort of place where neighbors knew each other's names, kids played until the streetlights came on, and crime was so rare it was almost a punchline in local conversation. The streets were slick with a recent rainfall, the kind that left the pavement reflecting the warm glow of porch lights, making the houses seem like islands in the dark. Inside the two-story home at the corner of Birch and Maple, Sam and Jessica Turner were winding down. Sam had just finished doing the dishes, running a hand through his damp hair, while Jessica folded laundry in the living room. Their 10-year-old daughter, Lily, was already asleep upstairs, tucked into her bunk bed under a quilt embroidered with little stars. It had been a long week. Sam's job at the local plant had left him exhausted, and Jessica had spent her evening organizing paperwork for her small online business. The house was warm, familiar, safe. At least that was what they believed. By 10:30, the house had settled into a comfortable silence. The rain tapped gently on the windows, punctuated occasionally by the squeak of the old heating vents. Sam leaned against the counter, stretching his arms, and noticed the side door to the garage was slightly ajar. He frowned. He was certain he had locked it after bringing in groceries that evening. "Jess," he called softly, "did you leave the garage door open?" Jessica looked up, frowning. "No, I thought you closed it." Sam's stomach tightened. He moved cautiously toward the door, his shoes squeaking slightly against the hardwood. The rain had left small puddles on the concrete floor of the garage, and the scent of wet earth and metal filled the air. His hand went to the light switch, and when he flipped it, the overhead bulb flickered to life, casting a pale yellow glow over the space. It looked normal. Nothing seemed out of place. He stepped inside, taking careful, measured breaths, his eyes scanning every corner. Nothing. The door to the backyard, the one leading out to the fenced-in yard, was closed and locked. Tools were neatly arranged along the wall. Everything seemed normal, yet the unease didn't fade. Sam closed the garage door and double-checked the locks. When he returned to the kitchen, he told Jessica what had happened, trying to keep his voice calm. "Probably just forgot to latch it properly. It's fine." Jessica nodded, though a tiny shiver ran down her spine. "Yeah, probably just that." They settled on the couch, Sam picking up the remote while Jessica carried the laundry basket upstairs. Moments later, she returned, setting it down and sinking beside him. They exchanged a small smile, both trying to shrug off the feeling that had settled in their stomachs. Around 11:15, as Sam reached for the remote to turn off the TV, a soft tapping sound drew his attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, coming from somewhere outside the back of the house. He froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Jessica tilted her head. "Hear what?" Sam pointed toward the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. "Someone? I don't know. Something." Jessica's hand went to her chest. "It's probably just the rain or a branch hitting the window. Don't worry." But the sound didn't stop. It became a rhythmic scratching, deliberate, moving across the siding near the door. Sam felt his pulse quicken. Something was out there. Something alive. He got up and approached the sliding door cautiously, pressing his forehead against the cool glass to peer out. The backyard was dark, the rain streaking across the window, distorting the shapes of the fence and the garden beyond. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow moving near the edge of the yard, but it could have been a trick of the light. Jessica came up behind him, placing a hand on his arm. "Sam, maybe we should just call the police." He nodded, pulling his phone from his pocket. As he dialed 911, the tapping intensified, followed by the sound of a window sliding open. His blood ran cold. Someone was inside. The dispatcher's voice was calm as he whispered his address. "Stay on the line. Officers are on the way. Do not confront the intruder. Go to a safe place with your family." Jessica grabbed Lily from her bed and whispered urgently, "Go into the bedroom with me. Lock the door. Don't make a sound." Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process what was happening. He glanced around the living room, spotting the baseball bat they kept propped in the corner for emergencies. He picked it up, gripping it tightly, and moved toward the stairs, making sure he stayed in the shadows. Downstairs, the intruder's presence was undeniable. The back door had been forced open, leaving a jagged gap in the frame, rain pouring in as the man stepped into the house. He was tall, broad, wearing dark clothing soaked from the rain. His movements were deliberate, calm, as if he had done this before. Um, in his hand glinted a knife, catching the dim light from the hallway lamp. Sam's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to focus. He knew he couldn't let the intruder reach the bedrooms. He backed into the kitchen, gripping the bat, and tried to make as little noise as possible. The man moved through the house methodically, checking doors, glancing around corners. He seemed patient, almost calculating. Sam's mind raced. How many were there? Was it just one man or more? He couldn't risk finding out. Suddenly, the intruder froze, tilting his head toward the stairs. Sam felt his heart leap. Had the man heard something upstairs? The sound of a child shifting in bed? A floorboard creaking under Jessica's cautious steps? Then the intruder moved again, heading straight toward the living room where Sam had been. He backed into a corner, swinging the bat as a warning. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice shaking despite his best attempt at authority. The intruder's eyes glinted through the shadows, and for a moment time seemed to slow. Then he lunged. Sam swung the bat with all his strength, striking the man in the arm. The intruder grunted but didn't go down. He recovered quickly, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it, forcing Sam to dodge back. The adrenaline coursing through Sam's veins was electric, his muscles straining, his mind screaming for escape. Upstairs, Jessica and Lily huddled together, listening to the struggle below. Every crash, every grunt, every shout made their hearts race. Jessica clutched the phone, whispering desperately into it, trying to keep Lily calm. Downstairs, the intruder's patience seemed to wane. He kicked over a small table, the crash echoing through the house, sending a shockwave of fear through Sam. He realized then that reasoning with this man was impossible. This was not a burglary in the conventional sense. This was something darker, more personal, more terrifying. Terrifying. Sam backed into the kitchen, searching for anything else that could be used as a weapon. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the counter and turned just in time to see the intruder advancing again. He swung with every ounce of strength he had, connecting with the man's shoulder. The intruder stumbled back, cursing, giving Sam a moment to catch his breath. Then, without warning, another figure appeared at the base of the stairs. A second man, shorter, stockier, holding what looked like a crowbar. Sam's blood ran cold. 2 of them. The second man lunged, swinging the crowbar. Sam ducked just in time, the weapon smashing into the wall behind him. Splinters flew, the sound deafening in the confined space. He swung the skillet again, striking the first intruder who had recovered, but the man advanced relentlessly. Sam realized he couldn't hold them both off. His mind raced. He had to get upstairs, had to reach Jessica and Lily, had to survive. He bolted toward the staircase, but the second man met him halfway, striking his shoulder with the crowbar. Pain exploded through him, but he pushed forward, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. Upstairs, Jessica screamed as she saw Sam stumble into the hallway, blood streaming from a cut on his arm. The intruders were close behind. She grabbed Lily and shoved her toward the bedroom, slamming the door and throwing the dresser in front of it as quickly as she could. "Get down," she whispered fiercely, pressing the child to the floor. Sam pushed the intruders back as best he could, swinging, yelling, every movement fueled by pure adrenaline. The first intruder twisted, raising the knife. Sam's heart froze, but just then, the wail of sirens pierced the night. The intruders froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. One cursed under his breath, glancing at the other. Then, as officers' flashlights illuminated the hall through the windows, they bolted. One tried the front door, the other jumped out a second-story window into the rain-soaked yard. The police moved in swiftly, securing the house. Sam collapsed against the wall, trembling, trying to catch his breath. Jessica clutched Lily, holding her close as tears streamed down her face. They were safe, for now. But the house, once a sanctuary, had been violated. Broken glass, splintered furniture, bloodstains, everything screamed that the ordinary, quiet life they had taken for granted could be shattered in moments. The memory of the intruders' eyes, their cruel smiles, would haunt them for years. Even after the police assured them the men would be pursued, the thought lingered. One of them had escaped. Somewhere out there, he was still watching, waiting for another chance. And every creak of the floorboards, every distant noise, every shadow in the corner of a room was a reminder that their home was never truly safe again. Story the end. The house at the end of Willow Creek Drive was the kind of house people noticed only when something went wrong. A modest two-story with peeling white paint and a sagging porch, it looked ordinary enough during the day, nestled among other suburban homes with neatly trimmed lawns and the occasional barking dog. But at night, the shadows pooled along the siding, the wind rattled the windows, and the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Lauren and Mark Jennings had only lived there for 6 months. They had moved from Chicago for work. Mark had a promotion that required him to relocate to a quieter town, and Lauren welcomed the change after years of city chaos. Their 10-year-old daughter, Emma, had adapted quickly, making friends at the local elementary school, and the couple had spent the first few months fixing up the house, painting, replacing broken floorboards, and making it theirs. By the time the late winter night came, the house was familiar, comforting even, and the neighborhood quiet. Mark had been working late at the office, and Lauren had been catching up on emails, Emma asleep upstairs, and the warmth of the fireplace filling the living room with flickering light. At 11:03 p.m., Lauren heard the first sound, a low scrape at the back door. She froze, listening. The scrape happened again, slow, deliberate. Her stomach twisted. The back door was locked. She knew she had double-checked it when she went to bed. She stood, moving cautiously toward the kitchen window that overlooked the fenced backyard. The glow of the streetlight beyond made it hard to see much. She thought she saw a shadow shift, but when she blinked, nothing was there. Her heart thumped in her chest. Maybe it was a branch brushing against the siding. Maybe it was nothing. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few minutes later, she heard the sound again. Only this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside. Lauren stumbled backward, pressing herself against the wall. The sliding door to the kitchen had been locked, but now there was a faint metallic creak from the other side, like someone testing it. She reached for her phone on the counter, trembling, and dialed 911, whispering quickly to the dispatcher, explaining that she thought someone was in the house. The dispatcher's calm voice tried to reassure her, telling her to stay quiet, stay in a safe place, and that officers were on their way. Lauren's mind raced. Where could she hide? She glanced toward the living room, toward the stairs leading upstairs to Emma's room. She needed to get to Emma. She couldn't leave her there if someone was in the house, but if the intruder was near the back, maybe in the kitchen, she didn't know what to do. Then came the sound of glass shattering. Lauren screamed silently into her hands. Her eyes darted around, seeing the shards of the back window scatter across the floor. Footsteps echoed in the kitchen, slow, methodical, deliberate, heavy boots moving across the tile. She dropped behind the sofa, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her voice trembled as she whispered to the dispatcher that someone was inside, that she couldn't move, that they might find her. The intruder's voice came then. Low, calm, almost mocking. I know you're in there. Lauren's blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, but no sound would escape. She pressed herself as close to the floor as she could, barely breathing. From upstairs came another noise, Emma's door creaking, followed by a soft whimper. Lauren's heart pounded harder than ever. Mom? Emma's voice called out, scared. Lauren whispered back, hide! Hide in the closet! She ran to the stairs, careful to stay in the shadows, and ushered Emma into the small linen closet at the top of the hallway. They crouched together, Lauren wrapping her arms around her daughter. The sound of footsteps upstairs made them both flinch. The intruder was in the house, moving, searching. He passed their bedroom, then down the hall, heavy boots scuffing the carpet. Lauren gripped the phone tighter, hearing the dispatcher assure her that officers were close. She wanted to believe it. From the kitchen below came the sound of drawers slamming open, a muffled curse, then the clatter of utensils hitting the floor. The intruder was methodical, taking his time, checking every corner. Lauren's mind raced. What would they do if he found them? She thought of the baseball bat Mark kept by the fireplace. Could she get it? But the risk of being seen was too great. A shadow passed by the closet door. The handle rattled once. Lauren held her breath, then silence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. They could hear nothing but their own breaths and the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Then suddenly, the bedroom door swung open. Lauren pressed herself against Emma, covering her mouth. A man's figure loomed in the doorway, masked, holding a crowbar. Lauren wanted to scream, to attack, but she knew there was nothing she could do. The man moved past the closet, methodical, checking the hall. His shadow fell across the floor. He paused, listening. Lauren felt her heart in her throat. She whispered to Emma to stay quiet, to breathe slowly. The footsteps retreated down the hall. Lauren didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs trembled too much to take even a single step. From downstairs came the sound of another window being broken. This time, it was closer to the front of the house. The intruder had an accomplice. Lauren's panic skyrocketed. They were not dealing with one man, but at least two, maybe more. Her mind flashed to the worst possibilities. The dispatcher's voice came again. "The police are outside. Stay hidden." Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed faintly through the blinds of the upstairs window. The intruders cursed. Heavy footsteps pounded down the stairs. Doors slammed, then silence. Lauren clutched Emma, tears streaming down both their faces. The house felt impossibly quiet now, but Lauren knew it was only a pause. Moments later, officers were inside, weapons drawn. They found Lauren and Emma in the closet, huddled together, shaking. Mark was downstairs, bloodied but conscious, having confronted one of the intruders in a brief, desperate struggle. The police swept the house and yard, but the intruders were gone, vanished into the night before they could be caught. Lauren and Mark clutched each other, exhausted, terrified, trying to calm Emma, who cried softly into her mother's shoulder. Their home was a mess. Broken glass, overturned furniture, torn locks, but worse than the physical damage was the psychological toll. The sense of safety they had taken for granted was gone. The officers promised to increase patrols, check security footage, and do everything in their power to find the intruders. But Lauren knew the house would never feel safe again. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow across the walls, every gust of wind rattling the windows would remind them of that night. Even after they moved to a different house in a different town, Lauren couldn't shake the memories. She would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, expecting to see shadows in the hallway, to hear the scrape of boots on the floor. The psychological scars lasted far longer than the physical ones. Lauren found herself jumping at every noise, scanning every corner of the room when she entered a new place. She couldn't bring herself to sleep with the doors unlocked or blinds open. The thought that someone could be inside without warning, without any sign, haunted her. Mark tried to reassure her, tried to tell her they were safe now, but even he flinched at unfamiliar noises, especially at night. Emma, though resilient, had nightmares that took months to subside, waking in terror at sounds that reminded her of the intruder. Lauren spent hours researching home security, installing cameras, extra locks, motion sensors, and an alarm system linked directly to the local police. They reinforced the doors, replaced windows, and even considered moving again, though it was costly. But no matter what they did, the memory of that night stayed. She remembered the calm, deliberate voice of the intruder as he rattled the closet door. She remembered the sound of heavy boots moving through the house, the cold certainty in the way they searched each room. She remembered feeling powerless, hiding with her daughter, praying they wouldn't find her. The haunting wasn't just about the night itself, it was about the realization that safety was fragile, that a moment's distraction, a misstep, a lapse in vigilance could allow strangers to invade the one place you thought you could always control, your home. Even years later, Lauren would find herself checking locks multiple times before bed, scanning the shadows outside, flinching at every unexpected sound. The home invasion had changed her, Mark and Emma, forever. The innocence of feeling safe in your own house had been shattered, and nothing could restore it. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the faint scraping of boots on the hardwood floor, the low, taunting voice, the rattling doorknob of the closet, and the terrified whimpers of her daughter. No house, no matter how secure, could ever feel completely safe again. Story the end. It was a Thursday night when Mark Whitman first sensed something was wrong in his home. The house itself was quiet, almost too quiet for a man who lived alone on the outskirts of Raleigh, North Carolina. He had moved into the neighborhood just under a year ago, seeking a fresh start after a messy divorce and the dissolution of his old life in Charlotte. The streets were lined with modest houses, some older than others, with small yards and the occasional rustling tree. It was the kind of neighborhood where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked in the daytime, though Mark had always been fastidious about locking everything at night. That night, Mark had returned from work around 8:15 p.m., tired and eager to relax after a long day managing a small logistics company. He set his briefcase down in the entryway and went to the kitchen to make a sandwich. The house smelled faintly of pine cleaner from when he'd done a quick sweep earlier in the day. He had just taken a bite when he heard it, a soft noise coming from the hallway leading to his bedroom. It was subtle, a scraping sound, almost like fingernails brushing against wood. At first, he froze, thinking it might just be a branch scraping against the side of the house. But then he realized the sound came from inside. His pulse quickened. He put down his sandwich and moved toward the hallway, listening carefully. Nothing. The house was silent again. He shook his head, muttering, "Get a grip, Mark. You've been working too much." He went to check the doors anyway, walking methodically through the living room, the kitchen, the small study at the back. Everything was locked. No signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. He returned to the kitchen, trying to resume his sandwich, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. Over the next few nights, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small. The sensation that someone was in the room with him when he was alone, the feeling of eyes on the back of his neck, objects slightly out of place. He would wake in the middle of the night to the faint sound of a door creaking or the soft scuff of footsteps on the hardwood floor. He rationalized it. Maybe the house was settling, maybe it was a mouse. But the unease kept growing. One night, around 11:30 p.m., Mark awoke to the sound of a window sliding open in his bedroom. He bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, and saw the faint outline of a figure outside the glass. He froze, unsure if he had imagined it. The blinds were slightly parted, and the figure appeared to be crouching on the ground, observing the house. Panic surged through him. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, but it was on the charger across the room. Every second felt like an eternity. The figure didn't move, just crouched there in the shadows. Finally, he grabbed the phone, dialed 911, and whispered to the dispatcher what he saw. By the time the police arrived, the figure was gone. They searched the property, found nothing, and suggested it might have been someone playing a prank or a passerby. But Mark knew what he had seen. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been watching his house. Mark installed additional locks and a security system with cameras, thinking that would provide peace of mind. For a few days, it seemed to work. Then the noises returned. Footsteps on the stairs when no one was home, the sound of a door handle rattling, the occasional tap on a window. The cameras recorded nothing unusual, at least nothing that could be clearly seen, but Mark could feel it. Someone was inside, moving around, waiting. It escalated one Friday night. Mark was in his study, working on reports for the next day, when he heard it, a soft whisper, low and guttural, coming from the hallway outside the study door. He froze, staring at the doorway. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. No answer. The whisper came again, this time just a syllable, almost like someone testing the air. Mark's hands went cold. He grabbed a heavy lamp from the desk, creeping toward the door, and slowly cracked it open. The hallway was empty. The living room door was slightly ajar, though he was certain he had closed it. His stomach twisted with dread as he walked toward it. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet. When he reached the living room, nothing seemed out of place. No one. Yet the unease persisted. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He kept checking the locks, the windows, listening for any movement. Around 2 a.m., he heard it again. Footsteps coming from the kitchen, slow and deliberate. He grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and slowly edged toward the kitchen door. The sound stopped abruptly as he approached. His breath caught. He swung the bat toward the doorway and shouted, "I'm calling the police." Nothing. Silence. He felt both relief and dread. Relief that nothing had attacked him, dread that someone had been there, just out of sight, playing a game of fear. The next day, Mark considered moving, but the thought of starting over seemed exhausting. He told himself that installing more cameras, upgrading locks, and sleeping with a weapon nearby would be enough to reclaim his sense of security. He tried to ignore the feelings of being watched, but it was impossible. The house felt alive with someone else's presence. Weeks passed, and Mark's routine became dominated by vigilance. Every sound, every shadow, every creak of the house demanded attention. He installed motion sensors, but the readings were always normal. He bought a high-powered flashlight and carried it around at night, shining it into every corner, checking every closet. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him, always, somewhere, just out of reach. One night, around midnight, he was awakened by a thud from the second floor. Heart racing, he grabbed the bat and flashlight, creeping up the stairs. At the top, he noticed the door to the guest bedroom was slightly open, though he had locked it earlier. He slowly pushed it open. The room was empty, but something caught his eye, an envelope on the bed. Mark's hands shook as he picked it up. Inside was a note, written in jagged handwriting. "You can't hide. I see you." He froze, the blood draining from his face. The note was new, the handwriting unfamiliar, the message clear. Someone had been inside his house. Someone had watched him. Mark called the police immediately. They dusted for prints, searched the property thoroughly, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no footprints. The officers warned him to stay vigilant, but there was little they could do. He felt trapped, watched, and every shadow in his house seemed to taunt him. He decided to install security cameras inside the house, covering every hallway and entrance. For a week, the footage showed nothing unusual. Then, one night, he noticed movement in the living room camera feed. A shadow crossed the room, tall, lanky, moving slowly and deliberately. It stopped at the edge of the frame as if aware it was being watched. Mark's hands shook as he zoomed in, enhancing the footage. There it was, a figure, crouched in the darkness, observing him even while he slept. Mark slept with the lights on that night, the bat across his chest. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the hiss of the heating vent, the scuff of a shoe, made his heart leap into his throat. He began keeping detailed logs of every incident, times, sounds, locations, even patterns in movement. It became an obsession, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't ignore the fact that someone had invaded his home, learned his habits, and seemed to be toying with him. Months went by. Mark's life shrank to his house and his work. He stopped going out at night, stopped answering the phone after dark, stopped socializing. The intrusions were consistent. Misplaced objects, doors left ajar, occasional notes slipped under the door. Each note was increasingly personal, referencing things only someone inside his home could know. One night, around 3 a.m., Mark awoke to a sound he had come to dread, a soft scratching on the door to his bedroom. He held his breath, clutching the bat. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate. Then a whisper, "It's time." Mark froze. The voice was inside his head and outside, simultaneously close and distant. He wanted to scream, run, anything. But he realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't just a home invasion. It wasn't a burglar, not in the ordinary sense. This was someone, or something, that had studied him, waited for him, and intended to make him understand that there was no escape. He stayed awake the entire night, the sound of scratching moving through the house, footsteps pacing, whispers echoing in his mind. By morning, he was exhausted, trembling, and more certain than ever that the intruder would never leave him alone. Mark tried moving after that, selling the house in haste, buying a small apartment across town. He hoped distance would help, but no matter where he went, the feeling followed. A shadow at the edge of his vision, a faint noise in the night. The sense that someone was always waiting, always watching. One evening, months later, while unpacking boxes in the new apartment, he found an envelope slipped under the door. Hands shaking, he opened it. Inside, written in the same jagged handwriting as before, "I found you again." Mark's blood ran cold. He realized then that it didn't matter where he went. The intruder had claimed him, not just his home, not just his life. His sense of safety, his peace of mind, his very sanity, everything had been taken. The horror wasn't a break-in or a robbery. It was the certainty that he was being hunted, that he was being stalked by someone who didn't need to steal, who didn't need to be seen, and who would never, ever stop. Mark Whitman never slept through the night again. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper reminded him that he was never alone. The intruder could strike anywhere, anytime, and he was powerless to stop it. He knew he would spend the rest of his life under surveillance by someone who had no name, no motive, and no end. And the most terrifying part? The intruder didn't even need to enter the apartment to terrify him anymore. The notes, the shadows, the whispers, they followed him, always. Mark had become a prisoner in his own life, haunted not by a physical presence, but by the psychological certainty that somewhere, always, someone was watching, waiting, learning, and planning. And he knew deep down that one day the game would end, but not on his terms. Story the end. It was a quiet, humid evening in the suburbs of Rockville, Maryland, the kind of night where the cicadas hum in a relentless chorus and the air hangs thick, almost oppressive. Streetlights flickered faintly along the tree-lined avenues, and most neighbors were tucked safely in their homes, windows shut against the warmth and humidity. In one of these houses, a two-story colonial at the end of Linden Drive, the Matthews family was settling into their nightly routines. Mark Matthews, 39, had just returned from a late shift at the local fire department. He was tired but alert, having spent the evening responding to calls and ensuring the safety of others. His uniform was still slightly damp from sweat, and the smell of smoke lingered faintly on his jacket. He set down his keys and glanced around the living room. His wife, Karen, 37, was folding laundry in the adjoining room while their two children left. 14-year-old Jessica and 9-year-old Ryan were playing a quiet game on the living room floor. The house felt secure, familiar, and safe. But safety, as it would soon become painfully clear, is often an illusion. Outside, hidden in the shadows beneath the overhanging branches of a large oak tree, a man watched the Matthews home. He was in his mid-30s, of medium build, with nondescript clothing that blended easily with the darkness. His face was obscured by a black balaclava, leaving only his eyes visible, and those eyes were sharp, calculating. He had been observing the family for weeks, noting the rhythm of their lives. Mark leaving for the firehouse, Karen's grocery runs, the times the kids went to bed, the quiet moments of relaxation. Tonight, he had decided, would be the night. The man had scouted the perimeter repeatedly, finding vulnerabilities. He had tried the front door during the day and found it locked, tested the windows for weakness, and observed the family's habits in detail. Now, with the sun fully set and darkness enveloping the neighborhood, he approached the back of the house, his movements silent and precise. The sliding glass door, he noted from days of observation, was often left slightly ajar when Karen carried groceries inside. Tonight, it was open just enough. Inside, Karen had finished putting away the last of the laundry. She glanced at the clock, 10:15 p.m., and called out to Mark. "I'm heading upstairs to get ready for bed," she said. "The kids can finish their game, and I'll check on them after." Mark nodded absent-mindedly, still going over his firehouse reports on his tablet. The house was quiet aside from the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional laughter from the kids. The intruder slipped through the sliding door with the ease of someone who had rehearsed every movement. He paused briefly, taking in the smell of the home, dinner remnants, laundry detergent, and the faint scent of Mark's cologne. He moved toward the living room, noting the placement of furniture, the path of least resistance, and most importantly, the locations of each family member. Mark, still absorbed in his work, was the first to sense something was wrong. A soft creak echoed through the hardwood floor, subtle but distinct. He froze, instincts kicking in, and glanced toward the hallway. Nothing moved. "Karen?" he called, a little louder this time. Still no response. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Something wasn't right. Upstairs, Karen had finished brushing her teeth and was heading toward the master bedroom when she noticed the closet door in the hallway was slightly ajar. That was odd. It should have been closed. She approached cautiously, her pulse quickening. A shadow flickered across the floor, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a trick of the light, a draft, the imagination running wild. But deep down she knew. She knew someone was in the house. The intruder had moved into the living room, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. He carried a small tactical knife and a crowbar, ready for both intimidation and force if necessary. He had no intention of negotiation. His goal was control, pure and simple. He paused for a moment, listening. He could hear the faint rustle of Karen moving upstairs, Mark in the living room, and the children laughing unaware. Mark, now fully alert, quietly reached for the baseball bat he kept by the recliner. He had no idea who or what he would confront, but instinct told him to be prepared. The creaking floorboards sounded again, closer this time. He swung his head toward the sound and saw a dark figure moving slowly near the doorway. Fear surged through him, but he kept calm, knowing that panic would only make things worse. Karen, hearing a low thud from below, froze. She realized with horror that the house wasn't empty. Someone had entered. She yelled, "Mark!" But the intruder had already noticed her. The figure in the living room tensed, his gaze flicking toward the staircase, calculating. The children, alerted by the shouting, ran toward the staircase. Jessica, brave but terrified, grabbed Ryan's hand. "Go to Mom's room," she whispered urgently. They dashed upstairs, hearts pounding, leaving the main floor vulnerable. The intruder advanced toward the stairs, crowbar raised. Mark met him halfway, swinging the bat with all the force he could muster. The sound of wood striking metal echoed through the house as the intruder blocked the swing with the crowbar, pushing back with a strength that made Mark stumble. The two men struggled, each fighting for control. The intruder's movements were calculated, almost mechanical, as though he had done this before. Karen, realizing she needed to protect the children, grabbed a kitchen knife and stepped toward the stairs. Her hands shook, but her resolve was fierce. "Stay away from them," she screamed. The intruder turned toward her, assessing the threat. Mark seized the distraction, swinging the bat again, this time striking the intruder in the shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall, snarling in frustration. The sound of sirens in the distance finally reached the ears of everyone inside. A neighbor, awakened by the commotion, had called 911. The intruder's eyes widened with panic. He glanced at the staircase, then at the front door. Realizing his time was limited, he made a split-second decision to retreat. He backed toward the sliding door, then bolted into the night, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had entered. The Matthews family huddled together, trembling, tears streaming down their faces. The children clung to their parents, terrified but safe. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing, officers quickly assessing the situation and securing the perimeter. Statements were taken, evidence collected, and the back door was documented as forcibly entered. Fingerprints and footprints were recorded, but the intruder had vanished without a trace. In the days and weeks that followed, the Matthews family struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. Sleep was disrupted by every creak of the floor, every distant siren, and every shadow that passed by the windows. The children needed constant reassurance, and even Mark and Karen found themselves double-checking locks, installing additional security cameras, and sleeping with the lights on. The home, once a place of comfort, had become a reminder of vulnerability. Therapy helped, but the psychological scars were lasting. Karen had recurring nightmares of the intruder standing at the foot of her bed, crowbar in hand. Mark sometimes woke in the middle of the night, imagining footsteps outside the door, ready to confront an intruder who wasn't there. Jessica and Ryan had trouble sleeping alone for months, their trust in the safety of their home shaken forever. The neighborhood, previously calm and friendly, now felt different. Neighbors exchanged wary glances, and the sense of community vigilance increased. The Matthews family became advocates for home security awareness, urging others to check locks, install cameras, and be conscious of routines that could make them predictable targets. Years later, the memory of that night remained vivid. Every summer evening, when the air was heavy and quiet, Mark and Karen would exchange a glance, silently acknowledging the terror they had survived. The intruder had not returned, at least physically, but the psychological impact lingered. Their home was fortified, their routines altered, and their vigilance constant. The Matthews family had endured an invasion of their sanctuary, and the lessons of that night were etched into their daily lives forever. Even now, when a shadow moves in the corner of the eye or an unexpected noise echoes through the house, the Matthews family remembers. Safety is fragile, and evil can walk through a door at any moment, shattering the illusion of normalcy in an instant. Story: the end. It was a Thursday night in the quiet suburb of Oak Ridge, the kind of neighborhood where neighbors waved politely and the streets were lined with old oak trees. Inside one of the two-story houses on Maple Lane, Tom and Rachel Sanders were finishing up their evening routine. Tom, a 35-year-old software engineer, had just returned from a late meeting and was settling onto the couch with a beer, while Rachel, a middle school teacher, finished washing the dishes. Their two kids, 12-year-old Sophie and 8-year-old Max, were already in bed, their soft snores drifting down the hallway. The house was peaceful, too peaceful, as Tom thought when he heard it, a faint creak from the kitchen. He paused, listening. The sound came again, a soft, deliberate scrape against the tile floor. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He knew the house inside out. He knew every creak and groan of the old wooden floorboards. This was different. "Rachel?" he called quietly. She emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. "What is it?" "I thought I heard something, like a scrape." Rachel frowned. "It's probably just the house settling. It does that sometimes." Tom wanted to believe her, but a sense of unease had settled in his chest. He rose from the couch and moved toward the kitchen, trying to appear casual. As he reached the doorway, he froze. The back door, which he was sure he had locked, was slightly ajar. "Rachel?" "The door," he whispered, his voice tense. She followed him, eyes wide. "What do you mean?" "I locked it after I brought in the groceries." Tom shook his head, his instincts screaming at him. He reached for the phone to call 911, but before he could dial, a shadow moved in the corner of the kitchen. The first intruder stepped into the dim light. Masked, tall, and imposing, the man carried a crowbar. He moved with quiet, predatory precision. Tom froze, trying to make sense of the sudden danger. The intruder lunged, and instinct took over. Tom swung the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase, at the man. It struck him on the arm, causing a grunt, but it barely slowed him down. Rachel screamed and ran toward the stairs, calling for the kids. Sophie's voice, scared and high-pitched, echoed from the hallway. "Mom? Dad?" The intruder advanced, swinging the crowbar. Tom tried to intercept him, but the man was relentless. The sound of splintering wood filled the kitchen as the intruder smashed the vase and knocked Tom backward. Upstairs, Rachel ushered Sophie and Max into their room, locking the door and pressing her body against it. "It's okay. It's okay," she whispered, though her own voice betrayed her fear. Downstairs, Tom was struggling. Another figure appeared, this one coming through the living room window. They weren't here to steal. They were here to terrorize, to destroy. Tom's mind raced. He had to protect his family, but he was outmatched. The two intruders coordinated silently, flanking him, forcing him toward the stairs. He grabbed a kitchen knife, the only weapon within reach, and swung wildly. One of the intruders laughed, a low, chilling sound. Upstairs, Rachel heard the fight intensify, the grunts, the thuds, the shouts. She clutched the phone, whispering to the 911 operator, trying to stay calm for the kids. The intruders reached the stairs, and Tom tried to block them, holding the knife like a lifeline. He slashed, connected with one of them, and the man stumbled, cursing. But the other intruder lunged at him, knocking the knife from his hand. The sound of breaking glass downstairs made Rachel's heart stop. They had smashed the front window, leaving another path of entry. "Mom! Dad!" Sophie screamed, banging on the bedroom door. Rachel tried to calm the kids. "Stay down! Don't make a sound!" Tom, battered and bleeding, saw a chance. One of the intruders had overextended, and he tackled him to the floor. The crowbar clattered across the hardwood. He wrestled with the man, holding him down, but the second intruder moved in, knife in hand. Rachel knew they couldn't fight them head on. She had to get the kids out. Spotting the window, she opened it carefully. It was a second-story window, but the bushes below could break a fall. "Jump! Quick!" she yelled. Sophie went first, then Max, Rachel following. They tumbled onto the bushes below, leaves tearing at their clothes and skin. Rachel heard the intruders screaming behind them, but the sirens started wailing in the distance. Someone had called 911. The intruders bolted, disappearing into the night before the police arrived. Officers found Tom, bloodied but alive, still holding on to the first intruder who had been subdued. Paramedics arrived, rushing him to the hospital while Rachel comforted the children on the lawn, shaking, crying, and overwhelmed by relief. The family survived physically, but the psychological toll was enormous. Sophie couldn't sleep without her parents in the room. Max developed anxiety that persisted for months, and Rachel found herself jumping at every small sound. Tom, despite his physical recovery, couldn't shake the memory of the intruders' faces, the crowbar swinging, the feeling of helplessness. The house was repaired, security systems installed, and neighbors became hyper aware of their surroundings. But the sense of safety that had once defined their home was gone. Every creak, every shadow, every knock at the door brought them back to that night, back to the terror that had invaded their lives. Even months later, the McCarthys, Tom and Rachel, had moved to a new home after that incident couldn't escape the lingering fear. The sense that someone could strike without warning, that their sanctuary could be violated so completely, remained with them. Every noise in the night, every stranger in the neighborhood reminded them that safety was fragile, fleeting, and often an illusion. Years passed, but the memory never faded. They could rebuild the house, reinforce the doors, install alarms, but nothing could erase the images from that night. The masked intruders, the splintered windows, the sound of Sophie and Max screaming. The experience left a permanent mark on their lives, a reminder that the quietest nights could conceal the most dangerous threats. Even now, when they sit quietly at night in their new home, listening to the wind rustling the trees outside, Tom and Rachel exchange glances, knowing that the terror they endured could return at any moment. Because once someone has crossed the threshold of your home, the feeling of safety, of control, never truly returns. It lingers, a shadow, a constant reminder of vulnerability, waiting for the next knock, the next sound, the next intruder. Story, the end. It started as a quiet, ordinary evening in the suburbs of Chicago. Mark and Jenna Wilson had just settled into their new home, a modest two-story brick house on a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood that seemed safe enough. Mark had been transferred for work, and Jenna was looking forward to putting down roots, away from the constant noise and traffic of the city. Their children, Lily, aged 10, and Ben, aged 7, were thrilled with their new bedrooms and the backyard, which promised endless summer afternoons of play. The first sign that something was wrong came a week after they moved in. It was late October, and Jenna was upstairs putting laundry away when she heard a faint creak from the staircase. She paused, thinking it might be Mark heading to the basement, but he was still at work. She told herself it was the house settling, an old floorboard adjusting to the cooler night air. Yet the feeling in her gut told her otherwise. She double-checked the locks on the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The following night, the unease escalated. Jenna was in the kitchen making dinner when she noticed the back door handle jiggle slightly, as if someone had tested it. Her heart pounded in her chest. She called Mark, who assured her it was probably just the wind or a loose handle, but he promised to install a new lock the next day. Still, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting, just outside the reach of the porch light. By mid-November, the Wilsons were living in a state of quiet paranoia. Their once normal routines had been altered. Mark began leaving work later so he could arrive home before dark. Jenna stopped letting the children play in the yard unsupervised, and all family members slept with doors locked, lights on, and a baseball bat or kitchen knife within arm's reach. The first real intrusion happened on a Thursday night. Mark had stayed late at the office, and Jenna was upstairs checking on the kids before bed. She heard a soft thump downstairs, then another, and then the unmistakable sound of glass cracking. Her blood ran cold. Someone was inside their home. She grabbed the bat she kept beside her bed and crept down the hallway, listening. The living room was in chaos. The window by the sliding glass door was shattered, the couch cushions slashed, and muddy footprints trailed across the carpet. Jenna screamed for Mark, her voice trembling. The intruder was gone by the time he arrived, leaving no one to confront and no tangible evidence beyond the mud, the broken glass, and a faint feeling of malevolent presence. The police came, dusted for fingerprints, and assured the family that it was likely a burglary gone wrong. But Jenna could see in Mark's eyes that he knew it was more than that. The intruder had been deliberate, leaving just enough chaos to terrorize without taking anything. Over the next few weeks, the Wilsons fortified their home. They installed an alarm system, surveillance cameras, motion-sensitive lights around the perimeter, and reinforced locks on every door and window. Yet the psychological terror persisted. Each time they went to sleep, they felt eyes on them, a sense that the house itself was no longer a sanctuary but a stage for an unseen predator. Then came the late night calls. It started with a single text on Jenna's phone. "I see you." She initially thought it was a wrong number, but then more came. "I'm inside your house now." Panic overtook her. She ran to check the locks. Every window, every door was secured. Mark came home soon after, furious and fearful. They contacted the police again, but the texts stopped before any trace could be found. It was as if the person behind them had disappeared into the shadows, leaving the Wilsons to question their own sanity. One particularly cold night in December, Mark and Jenna were awoken by a sound they could not ignore. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, echoed from the hallway. Lily and Ben were crying, trapped in fear in their beds. Mark grabbed a flashlight and a bat, Jenna a kitchen knife, and they slowly crept down the hallway. The footprints in the snow outside indicated someone had circled the house. The front door was locked, but the mud tracked into the living room was fresh, glistening with dew. The police response that night was faster, but again the intruder had vanished, leaving nothing behind except the footprints and a faint, lingering odor of cigarette smoke. It became apparent to the Wilsons that this was no ordinary burglar. This was someone who knew the house, knew their routines, and was intentionally instilling terror. By early January, the family's life had been reduced to a pattern of vigilance. They ate quickly, slept lightly, checked locks multiple times per night, and rarely left the house after dark. Their friends stopped visiting. The Wilsons' once bustling social life had vanished under the weight of constant fear. Max, their golden retriever, became skittish and aggressive toward shadows and noises that had previously been harmless. Then, one night, the intrusion escalated. Mark and Jenna were asleep when they were awakened by a crash in the kitchen. Mark, immediately alert, grabbed his bat and ran toward the sound. The front door was wide open, swinging in the wind, though Mark was sure he had locked it before bed. A shadow moved across the entryway, too fast to identify, and then a whisper, "Sleep tight." Jenna screamed, waking the children, who clung to her in terror. The intruder had been inside, right there in their home, leaving a message meant to frighten, to assert dominance. The police came again, more urgently this time, noting that the intruder seemed to be escalating in boldness. Surveillance footage captured nothing. Cameras mysteriously went offline for a brief period during the time of the intrusion. It was as though the intruder knew exactly how to bypass every safety measure. In February, the Wilsons decided to temporarily relocate to a friend's house while the police investigated further. They stayed there for 3 nights, trying to regain a sense of safety, but even there, Jenna felt watched, as if the fear had followed them. Returning home was no relief. The house felt alien, a prison where danger had been inside and could return at any moment. To fortify their sense of security, they added a panic room in the basement, reinforced doors with steel, and expanded their surveillance system to cover every inch of the property. They even began carrying concealed firearms, learning to handle them responsibly, though the presence of weapons only added to the underlying tension in the house. Despite all precautions, the psychological trauma was pervasive. Every small noise, a floorboard creaking, a branch tapping on a window, triggered a visceral response. Mark and Jenna rarely slept more than a few hours at a time. Lily and Ben began exhibiting signs of anxiety, often refusing to go into their rooms alone, and the family struggled to maintain normal routines. By the spring, the intrusions had become more subtle, but no less terrifying. Drawers were slightly ajar, personal items moved, doors found unlocked despite being secured. The family never saw the intruder again in person, but the presence was always felt, an invisible shadow stalking their lives. The Wilsons learned to live in a heightened state of alertness, a constant tension that replaced the normal rhythms of home life. Months later, the family made the difficult decision to sell the house. The psychological scars were too deep. No amount of security could erase the memories of being violated, of someone having been inside their home, knowing them intimately, and leaving only fear behind. When they left, they ensured all locks were changed and installed temporary security measures for the new owners, though the sense of lingering danger was something only they could understand. Even years later, Mark and Jenna struggled with the aftermath. Any unfamiliar noise triggered a flash of panic. Lily, now a teenager, would wake in the middle of the night, certain she heard footsteps in the hallway. Ben, though older, remained hyper-aware of locked doors and windows. The Wilsons' lives had been irrevocably altered by the home invasion. Safety was no longer something they could take for granted. The intruder had never been caught. Police files went cold, evidence remained circumstantial, and the Wilsons were left with a lifetime of hypervigilance and trauma. Friends and neighbors could not comprehend the depth of their fear. The once ordinary house on the quiet cul-de-sac had become the stage for a horror that could not be undone, a psychological imprint that would linger long after the doors were locked and the house sold. Years later, Mark and Jenna still talked about the intrusions, the nights of terror, and the feeling of being watched. They understood that home invasion was not just a theft of property, but a theft of peace, of security, of the very sense of safety that a home should provide. Every creak of the floor, every unexplained shadow, every sudden gust of wind could trigger memories of those nights when they were truly vulnerable. The Wilsons had rebuilt their lives elsewhere, but the lessons of those nights stayed with them. They learned that vigilance can never be complete, that fear can become a permanent resident, and that the sense of violation lingers far longer than any physical evidence. Even in a new home, far from the cul-de-sac in Chicago, they would double-check locks, ensure lights were on, and remain alert to the slightest hint of danger, because they had experienced firsthand the terror of an intruder inside their most private sanctuary. Safety, they realized, was an illusion once it had been shattered. The intruder had taken more than possessions. He had taken the Wilsons' innocence, their comfort, and their sense of peace. And while time would dull the raw terror, the knowledge that someone could breach a home so completely would remain with them forever. Story the end. It was a late autumn evening in northern Indiana, the kind of night when the cold seeps through every crack in the windows and the wind howls across the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Emily and David Harper had just finished moving into their new home, a modest two-story brick house on the outskirts of Fort Wayne. It wasn't a grand mansion by any means, but it was theirs, a fresh start for the young couple. Their son, Ethan, 8 years old and full of restless energy, had already claimed the upstairs bedroom with the big window overlooking the backyard, and he was busy setting up his collection of model airplanes. Emily was unpacking the kitchen boxes, the smell of takeout still lingering in the air, while David went to the garage to set up the new security system he had insisted on installing before they fully settled in. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, Emily thought, but she brushed it off as the natural silence of a suburban street late at night. As the clock approached 10, David came back inside, wiping his hands on a rag. "All set," he said. "I've got the cameras, the motion sensors, and the door alarms. Should be good for now." Emily smiled, relieved. "I guess that's one thing we don't have to worry about." They sat down to relax in the living room, Ethan playing quietly upstairs. The house felt empty but cozy, the kind of calm that made them both forget the stress of moving for just a moment. Emily curled up on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through her phone, while David adjusted the thermostat and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. It started as a faint sound, almost imperceptible, a tap, tap, tap coming from the front door. Emily froze, listening, but when she looked toward the door, the porch was empty, bathed in the yellow glow of the porch light. "Probably just a branch or the wind," she muttered to herself. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a soft, almost deliberate scraping sound. Emily's heart rate quickened. She looked at the security monitor David had set up. The live feed showed the porch empty, but she could swear she saw a shadow flicker across the screen. "David," she said, voice tight. "Someone's out there." David got up and peered through the peephole. "I don't see anything," he replied, though his brow furrowed. "Maybe it's just a stray animal." Emily wasn't convinced. Her unease grew as she continued unpacking. The sound had stopped for a moment, but a tension hung in the air that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Around 11, Ethan came downstairs, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, Dad, can I get some water?" Emily smiled weakly. "Sure, baby. Go get a glass from the kitchen. I'm right here." As Ethan turned to go, a shadow moved outside the kitchen window. Emily yelped and grabbed him, spinning him toward her. The figure outside froze for a second and then retreated into the darkness. David rushed over, peering through the window. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "Emily, did you see someone?" "I think so," she stammered. "They were just outside watching us." David grabbed his phone. "I'm calling the police." The dispatcher answered promptly, and David explained the situation. Officers were dispatched immediately, but Emily's anxiety only intensified while they waited. She and David moved Ethan into the bedroom, locking the door, and huddled together, listening. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then the sound of glass shattering came from the living room. Emily screamed. David grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and motioned for Emily to stay with Ethan. The intruders were inside. David crept toward the living room, trying to see through the darkness. He could make out two figures, moving cautiously but with purpose. They were methodical, checking drawers, rifling through cabinets. Their breathing was low but controlled, a stark contrast to the pounding of David's heart. Emily pressed herself against the wall, clutching Ethan, who was trembling. She wanted to scream, to call out, but she knew it could draw attention. The police were on their way, but she didn't know how long it would take. One of the intruders moved toward the staircase leading to the bedrooms. Emily's breath caught in her throat. That's where Ethan was. She whispered to him to stay quiet, her own fear making it almost impossible to keep her voice calm. David returned briefly, signaling her to follow him. He had managed to stay undetected so far, guiding them toward a small hall closet that could serve as temporary shelter. They crouched inside, trying to control their breathing as the intruders searched the house. The intruders were thorough. They moved from room to room, opening doors, checking cabinets, rifling through belongings. Each sound, the scrape of a chair, the click of a door handle, sent waves of panic through Emily and Ethan. She held her son close, whispering reassurances she didn't fully believe herself. Suddenly, footsteps approached the closet. One of the intruders paused, crouching to look inside. Emily could see a shadow moving past the crack beneath the door. The figure was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and its hand hovered near the doorknob. "Check the upstairs," a low male voice said. "They have to be hiding there." Emily's stomach dropped. They knew. The footsteps receded, moving toward Ethan's bedroom. Emily's mind raced. She had to do something. Waiting in the closet felt like an eternity. She peeked through the edge of the door and saw the intruder disappear up the stairs. David whispered urgently, "We need to move now." He led Emily and Ethan through the house, moving as quietly as possible toward the back staircase that led to the attic. The attic had a small window that could serve as an escape route if needed. Halfway there, a floorboard creaked beneath Emily's foot. One of the intruders stopped and turned. Her heart pounded in her chest. David raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. The intruder tilted his head, then resumed moving toward the upstairs bedrooms. They reached the attic and climbed the narrow stairs, Emily holding Ethan close. The small space was dusty and cramped, but it offered a temporary refuge. She pressed her son against the wall, trying to calm his trembling body. From below, she could hear the intruders moving through the house, their voices low but urgent. Emily's phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. It was the dispatcher. "Officers are nearby. Stay put." Minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the night. The intruders froze, then tried to flee. David emerged from hiding, confronting one of them in the living room. A brief struggle ensued before the intruders ran out the front door, disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived moments later, securing the property and taking statements. Both intruders were apprehended, known in the area for a string of home invasions targeting suburban families. Thankfully, no one was physically harmed, but the psychological scars were immediate. Emily and David spent the rest of the night comforting Ethan, unable to sleep. The house that had once felt safe and warm now seemed alien. Every creak in the floor and shadow in the hallway a potential threat. In the weeks that followed, they installed reinforced locks, security cameras, motion sensors, and even an alarm system connected to a private monitoring service. But the sense of vulnerability remained. Emily found herself checking doors multiple times before bed. David double-checked the windows, and Ethan, even after reassurance, would sometimes wake in the night calling out for his parents. Therapy sessions helped, but the fear lingered, etched into their daily lives. The Whitman house, once a place of comfort and new beginnings, became a constant reminder of how quickly safety could be stripped away. Even years later, Emily would sometimes glance at a shadow at the window, a tap on the door, or a misplaced object and feel the same creeping dread from that night. The intruders were imprisoned, and life gradually resumed a semblance of normalcy. But the invisible scars remained. The family moved, hoping distance would bring relief. But home invasions leave more than physical damage. They leave a permanent fracture in the perception of safety, a psychological residue that refuses to fade. Even on bright, sunny days, the fear lingered. Every unexpected sound, every shadow, every stranger passing by was a reminder of that night. Emily, David, and Ethan survived, but the sense of security, the innocent trust in their home, had been irrevocably shattered. They learned that true safety is never guaranteed, that the ordinary can turn dangerous in a heartbeat, and that the home, no matter how well guarded, is only as safe as the people inside it. The Harper family endured, but they never forgot. Every lock, every alarm, every precaution was a reminder of what they had faced and what they could face again. Their home was theirs, but it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield, a memory etched in fear, and a warning that terror can invade even the most ordinary lives. Story the end. The sky had been darkening all day, heavy clouds rolling in from the northwest, promising rain by evening. In the small town of Crestwood, a quiet street lined with two-story houses and neatly trimmed lawns seemed immune to the kind of danger that haunted the headlines in the cities. But for Michael and Sarah Thompson, home alone on a Tuesday evening, the quiet would soon become suffocating, and the safety they felt in their suburban bubble would shatter in a matter of hours. Michael had just gotten home from work, tired from a long day at the auto shop. Sarah, who worked from home as a freelance editor, was finishing up her final edits for a client. Their children, 12-year-old Emma and 9-year-old Luke, were at a friend's house for a sleepover, leaving the house eerily empty for the first time in weeks. The couple had been looking forward to a quiet evening, cooking dinner together and watching a movie. As Michael walked up the driveway, he noticed something odd. A small pile of leaves near the side gate, scattered in a way that didn't seem natural. He dismissed it, attributing it to the wind or perhaps the neighbor's cat. Inside, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every creak and groan of the settling structure feel amplified. Sarah called out, "Hey, you're home early," but got no response beyond the sound of her husband's shoes on the hardwood floor. When Michael entered the kitchen, he noticed the back door was slightly ajar. His stomach dropped. He was sure he had locked it that morning. "Sarah," he called, trying to keep his voice calm, "is the door open?" She hurried over, frowning, and confirmed it. "I definitely locked it," she said. They both stood there for a moment, the quiet between them suddenly heavy, charged with unease. "Maybe it didn't latch properly?" Michael suggested, trying to rationalize the situation. Sarah nodded, though her unease had grown. They checked the locks, ensuring everything was secure, and Michael decided to take out the trash. As he stepped outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees, and he felt the first prickle of fear, though he told himself it was just the weather. The trash bins were at the edge of the driveway, near the streetlight that flickered intermittently. As Michael walked back, he thought he saw a shadow move across the living room window. He froze, straining to see through the dim light. "Probably just a reflection," he muttered to himself. But the shadow moved again, slower this time, deliberate, as if someone inside the house was pacing. He quickly re-entered the house, his heart beginning to race. Sarah looked up from her laptop. "What is it?" she asked. He, alarmed by his sudden pallor. I think I saw someone inside," he whispered. She frowned, her hand going to the small set of knives on the counter. They moved quietly through the house, checking each room. Everything seemed in place, but the sense of being watched had intensified. The air felt thick, almost electric, as if the house itself was aware of their tension. Michael and Sarah returned to the kitchen, trying to convince themselves it was nothing. Yet, as they spoke, a soft thump came from upstairs, an unmistakable sound of someone walking. Michael grabbed the baseball bat from the corner, and Sarah reached for her phone. 911, she whispered, dialing quickly. The dispatcher answered, and Sarah explained the situation, voice trembling. The dispatcher's instructions were clear. Stay in a secure room, lock the doors, and do not confront the intruder. Michael and Sarah moved into the master bedroom, locking the door and turning off the lights. From their vantage point, they could hear the soft creak of the stairs, slow and deliberate. Whoever was in the house was methodical, experienced. Every heartbeat seemed amplified in the silence. The intruder spoke, a low, controlled voice. I know you're here. Let's make this easy. It was male, calm, frighteningly confident. The couple held their breath, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, moving into the hallway outside their bedroom. The doorknob rattled slightly, a warning that the intruder was testing the locks, searching for a way in. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then a loud crash echoed from the living room, followed by the sound of glass breaking. Michael and Sarah exchanged terrified glances. The intruder was not just rummaging, he was destroying, leaving a trail of chaos behind him. The realization hit. He knew they were home, and he had no intention of leaving without asserting control. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone again. Police are 5 minutes out. Stay calm. Keep quiet. But calm had abandoned them long ago. Michael crouched behind the bed, gripping the bat, while Sarah hid under the covers, phone pressed to her ear. They listened as the intruder moved through the hallway, the soft scrape of shoes against the carpet echoing like a predator's whisper. Then a pause. Silence. Rachel, trying to make sense of it, whispered, Maybe he's gone? But the instinctive fear told her otherwise. Something was wrong. Too wrong. The intruder was patient, calculating. He might wait hours if necessary. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled violently. Michael swung the bat, but the door held firm. The intruder's voice was closer now, almost outside the door. Don't make this hard, he said. The tension was suffocating. The police arrived, sirens wailing, and the intruder bolted. Michael and Sarah, adrenaline surging, rushed out of the room to meet them. Officers combed the house and the surrounding area, but found only signs of the intruder's presence. Drawers pulled open, valuables scattered, a small smear of blood where he had cut his hand on the broken glass. The investigation revealed that the man had a history of home invasions, targeting houses where occupants were alone. He had been monitoring their neighborhood for weeks, learning routines, studying entrances and exits. The realization that they had narrowly escaped a potentially fatal encounter left Michael and Sarah shaken to their core. In the weeks that followed, the couple fortified their home with reinforced locks, cameras, and motion sensors. Yet every creak, every shadow, every unexpected sound kept them on edge. Sleep was interrupted by nightmares of a man lurking in the hallways, watching, waiting. They learned from the police that the intruder had been arrested trying to break into another home nearby. His criminal record was extensive, including assaults during burglaries. Though he was behind bars, Michael and Sarah felt no relief. The memory of his calm, methodical invasion lingered, a permanent scar etched into their minds. Months passed, but the sense of vulnerability never faded. Sarah couldn't stop checking locks multiple times before bed. Michael installed security cameras covering every angle, but even then, shadows in the corners of rooms triggered panic. Every knock, every car passing slowly, every creak of the floorboards was a potential threat. One evening, Sarah came home to find a note slipped under the door. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. In jagged letters, it read, "You can hide, but I know where you are." The police were called, canvassing the area, but no one was found. Fear had taken root again, Chikash proving that the trauma of being hunted did not end with the intruder's capture. The Thompsons eventually moved to another town, seeking a fresh start. But the experience left an indelible mark. Michael couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in new homes. Sarah's sleep was often interrupted by dreams of shadows and whispers. The children, now aware that danger could touch their lives, were more cautious than ever. Years later, the couple still recounted the night with a mixture of disbelief and lingering terror. The quiet suburban streets, once symbols of safety, had become reminders of vulnerability. The home invasion had changed them forever, teaching them that safety was fragile, and fear once planted could never fully be uprooted. Even in a secure house with alarms and cameras, the memory persisted. Every storm, every creak, every flicker of light reminded them of that night. Home, a place of comfort and family, had been violated, and the shadow of that violation remained, shaping the way they lived, loved, and slept. The knowledge that someone had been inside their home, walking through their rooms, knowing their routines, left a permanent imprint. It wasn't just a crime, it was a psychological invasion, a terror that lingered long after the intruder had been apprehended. The Thompsons had survived, yes, but the fear had not left. It was a part of them now, Chica, an invisible companion that reminded them that safety could be shattered in an instant, and that vigilance was a lifelong necessity. Even now, when Michael and Sarah sit quietly in their living room, they can feel it, the subtle sense that eyes are watching, that shadows move with intent. The world had changed, their home had changed, and they had changed. The invasion had introduced a new reality, that danger could appear anywhere, that the ordinary could conceal menace, and that some fears, once sown, never truly die. Years later, they would tell the story to friends, relatives, anyone who would listen, hoping to convey the terror and the caution it instilled. But words could never fully capture it. The fear had seeped into the fabric of their lives, altering every decision, every sense of security. It was a reminder that home is not always a sanctuary, and that safety is not guaranteed, no matter the locks, cameras, or alarms. The experience left them vigilant, cautious, and forever changed. The night of the invasion remained vivid in their minds. The sounds, the shadowy movements, the calm, menacing voice. It was a memory that could not be erased, a lesson carved into their lives about vulnerability, fear, and the thin line between safety and terror. No matter how many precautions they took, the knowledge lingered. Someone had been inside their home, someone who knew their routines, someone who could have hurt them. That knowledge was permanent, an invisible scar that served as a constant reminder of human vulnerability, of the lurking dangers in the world, and of the night that had shattered the illusion of safety forever. Story the end. It started as an ordinary Friday night, the kind where the quiet of the suburbs makes the occasional creak of a tree feel unnervingly loud. Megan had been working double shifts at the hospital, and by the time she pulled into the driveway of her small single-family home in Ohio, she was bone-tired. The streetlights were dim, the mist from the previous rain still clinging to the asphalt, and for a moment, the emptiness of the neighborhood made her uneasy. She told herself it was just exhaustion. The house had been hers for 3 years, and nothing bad had ever happened. It was her sanctuary. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, carrying the weight of another grueling week. The faint smell of home, candle wax, laundry detergent, and the faint aroma of the coffee she'd brewed that morning was comforting. She flicked on the lights in the hallway and living room. Everything seemed normal. But as she set her bag down and moved toward the kitchen, something caught her eye. The back door, which she was sure she had locked before leaving for work, was slightly ajar. Her stomach knotted. She approached cautiously. The latch was intact, the lock unbroken. It made no sense. Megan's mind raced, conjuring scenarios, each more unsettling than the last. She checked the windows. They were all locked. Nothing was out of place, nothing missing. Her heart slowed a little, rationality creeping back in. Perhaps the door had been left unlocked in her fatigue, a simple oversight. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the lingering unease. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak, every groan of the house sounded amplified in the silence. At around 2 a.m., she thought she heard a faint tapping at the back door. Tap, tap, tap. She froze, her pulse hammering. It stopped as suddenly as it began. She didn't move for what felt like hours, afraid that even the slightest sound would confirm her fears. Eventually, she worked up the courage to look through the blinds. The backyard was empty, the shadows of the trees swaying gently. She forced herself back to bed, though her eyes refused to close. The next morning, Megan noticed subtle but disturbing changes. A chair was slightly shifted, a framed photo tilted ever so slightly, fingerprints faintly smudged across the kitchen counter. Her mind tried to rationalize it, but the gnawing feeling of violation grew stronger. She called her best friend, trying to brush it off as paranoia, but the tightness in her chest refused to dissipate. Over the next few days, the disturbances escalated. Footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. The faint scent of cigarette smoke, even though she didn't smoke. Small items moved from their usual places, disappearing and reappearing later, subtly altered. Megan began sleeping with a kitchen knife beside her her phone never far from reach. She tried to convince herself it was stress, but a part of her knew this was no ordinary series of mishaps. One evening, while preparing dinner, she heard whispering from the living room. It was low, indistinct, but undeniably human. She froze, knife in hand, straining to hear. The whispering stopped the instant she stepped into the room. Her heart raced. She had begun to suspect someone had been entering her home while she was at work. The thought was terrifying, and yet chillingly plausible. She called the police, explaining her fears. They came, inspected the home, found no evidence of forced entry, and offered reassurances. "You're safe here," the officer said. But Megan did not feel safe. Determined to catch the intruder, she installed several security cameras throughout the house, in the living room, kitchen, and hallway. For days, the footage showed nothing unusual. Then, one night around 3:15 a.m., a figure appeared. It was slow, deliberate, almost shadow-like, moving across the hallway. It paused briefly, then disappeared out of frame. Megan's hands shook as she watched. There was no doubt about what she had seen. Someone had been in her home. The police returned, this time taking the footage seriously. They searched again, but there were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. Megan, terrified and exhausted, agreed to stay with her friend for a while. Even there, she could not escape the sense of being watched. Dreams were plagued with shadows creeping through her house, whispering her name. Each night she woke, drenched in sweat, listening for sounds that never came but always felt imminent. Weeks later, she returned home, hoping the nightmare had ended. As she stepped inside, her unease returned in full force. Something was off. Her kitchen chair was overturned, the small rug in front of the sink bunched up as if someone had stood on it. On the counter, a note scrawled in erratic handwriting, "I know you're alone tonight." Megan's stomach turned to ice. Her phone was in her bag, but it had no signal. The note was proof that someone had been inside while she was away, and now they had been back again. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, there was no one. No fingerprints, no footprints. Megan began sleeping in the living room, keeping the front door in sight, watching shadows with a vigilance born of terror. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows felt like movement, like the intruder was there again, just beyond the edge of perception. As days turned into weeks, the intrusions became more aggressive. Megan would come home to doors slightly ajar, furniture rearranged, and notes that were increasingly personal, referencing things only she would know. It was clear, this wasn't a burglary. It was a personal game, an intimate stalking that eroded her sense of security. She installed more cameras, double-locked doors, motion sensors, and alarms, but the fear remained. Each night she listened for the telltale creak of footsteps, the soft brush of movement in the shadows. One night, around 2:30 a.m., she woke to a noise in the kitchen. It was subtle at first, a soft shuffling, then a dragging sound. Megan's heart raced as she grabbed her baseball bat and crept toward the noise. As she rounded the corner, she saw nothing, only the faint outline of her dining table, a chair tipped slightly, a mug knocked over. She froze. Then a whisper, so close it felt like it was in her ear. "I'm here." She spun around. No one was there. Her pulse skyrocketed. Megan backed into the hallway, realizing she was trapped between the intruder and her own fear. The whisper came again, now multiple voices, overlapping, teasing, circling. She pressed herself against the wall, clinging to the bat, listening to the silence that was filled with presence. Hours passed like minutes. When the police finally arrived, there was nothing to find. No one, no evidence, just a terrified woman and a home that seemed to pulse with unseen activity. After that, Megan moved. She sold her house, purchased a small apartment several towns away, and attempted to rebuild her life. But the feeling never left. She would catch glimpses of shadows at the edge of her vision, hear faint whispers, feel the cold brush of air that was not there. Even in her new home, the paranoia lingered. She locked doors, checked windows obsessively, and installed the most advanced security system she could afford. Yet every time she closed her eyes at night, she was back in that house, hearing footsteps, whispers, and the slow, deliberate approach of someone who knew her intimately, who had entered her life without invitation and refused to leave. Months later, Megan began noticing subtle signs again in the apartment. A picture frame slightly tilted, a window lock that felt off, a chair moved from its usual position. It was as if the intruder had followed her, as if the presence had never left. Friends suggested it was paranoia, lingering trauma, but Megan knew better. She could feel the eyes on her, was the unseen watcher who had learned her routines, her fears, her weaknesses. She began sleeping with a small hammer and a knife under her pillow, every sound amplified, every creak terrifying. The apartment, her supposed sanctuary, felt as vulnerable as her old house. Then one night, around 3 a.m., it happened again. Megan woke to a noise downstairs, dragging sound, soft and deliberate. She grabbed the knife and crept down the hall, heart pounding, sweat drenching her clothes. At the bottom of the stairs, she saw the front door ajar. She backed away slowly, trying to remember the lock she had checked 100 times. Something moved in the shadows, subtle and deliberate. She froze as a whisper reached her ears. "You can't hide." The voice was calm, intimate, chillingly familiar. Megan backed into the corner, realizing there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The intruder was inside again, unseen, untouchable, playing with her fear, her life, her mind. The police found her the next morning, huddled in the corner of the living room, exhausted, eyes wide, clutching the knife. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing to indicate that anyone had actually been there. Yet every piece of evidence, the disarray, the notes, the movements, told a story of intrusion and terror that defied logic. Megan knew with absolute certainty that someone or something had invaded her life and would continue to do so. Her sense of safety, once absolute, had been shattered. Every creak, every shadow, every whispered sound was a reminder that the intruder could return at any moment. Years later, Megan still lives with that knowledge. She never feels truly safe, never truly sleeps. Shadows remain just beyond her perception. Every unexplained noise a potential signal that the intruder has returned. She has moved several times, changed her routines, installed every conceivable security measure, yet the fear never leaves her. Somewhere out there, the intruder waits, patient, silent, knowing, always just beyond the edge of her awareness, ready to strike again. And Megan knows she is never truly alone. Not really. Story the end. It was a Friday night like any other, the kind of evening that promises nothing more than quiet routine. The streets were unusually empty for early October, the chill in the air hinting at the approaching winter. Leaves crunched underfoot as Megan Walters walked briskly from her car to the door of her townhouse, keys jingling in her hand. She had just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital, exhausted and ready to collapse on her couch with a frozen dinner. She lived alone in a suburban neighborhood just outside of Dayton, Ohio, a place she had always considered safe. Neighbors waved from across the street, children laughed somewhere down the block, and the faint glow of porch lights bathed the pavement in soft pools of yellow. Megan's apartment was on the first floor, tucked at the end of the building with windows overlooking the small grassy courtyard. She had always appreciated the privacy it offered, though she never thought much about the vulnerabilities that came with being on the ground floor. Her steps were quick, almost impatient, as she reached her door, eager to lock it behind her and step out of the crisp night air. She didn't notice the figures standing across the street until she nearly bumped into them with the door. A man, mid-30s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, leaned against a lamppost, phone in hand. His face was obscured by the shadow of the hood. Megan's first thought was to smile politely and move past, but something about the way he lingered made her stomach twist. She fumbled with her keys, heart picking up pace, and slipped inside, locking the door behind her. She exhaled, trying to calm herself, attributing the unease to fatigue. The apartment was warm, smelling faintly of vanilla from a candle she had lit earlier. Megan set her bag down on the counter and took a deep breath, grateful for the familiar stillness. She kicked off her shoes and made her way to the living room, where her cat, Oliver, greeted her with a soft meow. The little routine brought her comfort, the mundane acts of home life that reminded her she was safe. She changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt, turned on the television, and sat down to eat the frozen pasta she had brought home. The first unsettling sign came from the back door, where she heard a faint creak. It was subtle, almost ignorable, but it made her pause mid-bite. She told herself it was the house settling, the temperature dropping, or maybe even Oliver brushing against the door. Still, she rose and moved to check, her footsteps soft against the carpet. The door was locked as she had left it. Megan shook her head and laughed nervously, returning to the couch. Then came the sound of footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. Her stomach knotted. She lived alone, and there was no reason for anyone to be up there. The sound of each step pressed into the silence like a physical weight. She grabbed her phone, heart hammering, and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver. The dispatcher's voice was calm, instructing her to stay put and get somewhere safe. Megan retreated to the bedroom, locking the door and sliding the bolt into place. Her eyes darted around the room. The dresser? Closet? Bed? None offered any real protection. She grabbed the baseball bat she kept under the bed, the metal cold in her hands, a small anchor in a storm of fear. The footsteps moved closer. Megan could hear the intruder now, breathing softly, shifting in rhythm with her own terror. The doorknob rattled. Panic surged like a wave, threatening to pull her under. She swung the bat preemptively, her muscles taut with fear. The doorknob twisted violently, and the door burst open. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, masked in black, stepped into the room. His eyes glinted in the dim light, and Megan felt bile rise in her throat. He lunged at her, and she swung the bat with all her might. It connected with his shoulder. He cursed, a low, threatening sound, but recovered quickly, advancing toward her again. Desperation fueled her actions. She ran toward the window, shoving it open and climbing onto the narrow ledge. The cold night air bit at her skin as she dropped to the grass below, pain shooting through her legs, but she didn't stop. She ran down the street, barefoot, until she reached a neighbor's house. The police arrived minutes later, taking statements and inspecting the apartment. Signs of forced entry were clear. Scratches along the back door frame, muddy footprints on the kitchen floor, a door left swinging in the wind. Nothing had been stolen. But for Megan, that wasn't the point. The violation itself had fractured the sense of safety she had taken for granted all her life. Sleep became a stranger after that night. Every creak in the apartment, every whisper of wind against the windows, set her heart racing. She triple-checked locks, installed a security system, and even placed motion detectors in every room. Yet the anxiety never fully dissipated. She would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, bat in hand, listening for sounds that weren't there. Her dreams were plagued with shadowy figures moving through her apartment, whispering her name and inching closer until she would wake screaming, drenched in sweat. Weeks later, she returned home from work late one night to find the front door unlocked again. Her stomach sank. She had checked it before leaving. Panic rose immediately. She dialed 911, retreating to her bedroom, but this time there were no footsteps following her. No intruder appeared. The sense of being watched, however, remained heavy, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Police searched, found nothing, and left her with reassurances she couldn't believe. Something had infiltrated her life, left its mark, and disappeared without trace. Megan eventually moved to a new apartment several towns away, hoping distance would bring relief. But the terror had become a permanent resident in her mind. Every creak, every knock, every shadow was a potential threat. She slept with her baseball bat within arm's reach, triple-checked every lock, and set timers for lights to simulate occupancy. The feeling of being watched never left. She understood now that safety was a fragile illusion, a condition that could be shattered in a single, terrifying moment. Even years later, the memory of that night haunted her. She could still recall the sound of the doorknob rattling, the sight of the intruder's masked face, the sensation of her own helplessness. The ordinary life she had known before was gone, replaced with an acute awareness of vulnerability. No lock, no camera, no security system could erase the knowledge of violation. Megan had survived the home invasion, but its shadow followed her relentlessly, a permanent scar etched into the fabric of her daily existence. She never stopped checking the locks, never stopped listening for the faintest sounds in the night. Even in her new home, she sometimes woke to imagined creaks, breathing shallow, bat in hand. The terror had become a part of her, inseparable from her sense of normalcy. The home she once felt safe in had been violated, and once that line is crossed, nothing could restore the feeling of complete security. The world had shifted, subtly and irreversibly, leaving Megan with the knowledge that danger could come at any time, unannounced, and the shadow of that night would follow her wherever she went. Story the end. The night was unusually quiet for a Friday in early October in a sleepy suburb of Michigan. Streetlights flickered intermittently, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind was the only sound breaking the stillness. The house at 312 Hawthorne Lane looked ordinary from the outside. A two-story brick home with white trim, a neatly mowed lawn, and a single oak tree casting shadows across the driveway. Inside, however, the night was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. Samantha and her husband Daniel had moved into the house just over a year ago. Both in their late 20s, they had recently started a family, welcoming a baby girl named Lily 3 months earlier. Samantha was feeding the baby in the nursery while Daniel prepared for an early morning shift at the local power plant. Their home was meant to be a safe haven, a place where the stresses of work and parenthood could be put aside. But safety is a fragile illusion, and tonight that illusion would shatter. Daniel set his coffee mug on the counter and stretched. He had just finished a late-night check on the front door and the windows, a routine he had developed after reading too many news stories about break-ins. "All locked up," he muttered, half to himself, half to Samantha, who was rocking Lily gently. The house was silent except for the soft cooing of the baby. Around midnight, Samantha finally laid Lily back in her crib and walked into the living room. She could hear the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then came the sound, a low, deliberate creak from the back of the house. Samantha froze. The sound had come from the kitchen, near the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. She convinced herself it was just the old floorboards settling, a trick of the wind, and poured herself a glass of water. Meanwhile, Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from his long day. His dreams were light and fragmented, a mixture of work stress and baby duties. He was woken by a faint noise, a tapping against glass, rhythmic and deliberate. He sat up, heart pounding, listening. The tapping continued, coming from the kitchen. Daniel's stomach tightened. He was awake now, senses alert, and instinct told him that this was not the wind. He quietly retrieved a baseball bat from under the couch and crept toward the kitchen. Samantha, noticing his absence, followed, her mind racing with anxiety. As they approached the sliding door, they could see the faint outline of a figure moving outside, partially obscured by the darkness and shadows from the porch light. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and stood unnervingly still. Daniel whispered, "Call 911." Samantha fumbled with her phone, hands shaking as she dialed the emergency number. The dispatcher's calm voice provided little comfort as they quietly explained the situation, trying not to draw attention. The figure outside shifted slightly, crouched, and then darted out of view. Daniel and Samantha remained frozen, listening to every sound. The intruder returned almost immediately, moving with unsettling precision. The sliding door creaked slightly as the figure tested the lock. Daniel lunged, slamming the door shut and turning the deadbolt. But the figure was patient, methodical, persistent. It was clear that this person had done this before. For the next 15 minutes, the intruder circled the house, testing doors and windows, while Daniel and Samantha huddled together, clutching the baby monitor. They could hear muffled thumps against the doors, scratches on the siding, and occasional footsteps. Every sound made their hearts race, a visceral reminder of how quickly the sanctuary of their home could be violated. Finally, a car drove slowly down the street, the headlights illuminating the yard. The figure paused, glanced toward the street, and retreated into the shadows. Daniel and Samantha breathed a temporary sigh of relief, but the tension did not leave. They knew that the intruder was likely still there, waiting, calculating their next move. They spent the rest of the night in the living room, Lily between them, every creak and groan of the house magnified by fear. The first light of dawn brought some relief, but also the reality that their home, once a place of comfort, now felt vulnerable and unsafe. Over the next several days, Daniel installed additional locks on every door and window, reinforced the sliding door with a metal bar, and even installed security cameras. Samantha could not shake the memory of the shadowy figure outside, and often checked on Lily multiple times each night. They tried to maintain normal routines, but the fear lingered, a subtle and persistent presence in every corner of their home. 1 week later, the intruder returned. This time, they had entered the house through the unlocked basement window. Daniel had left it slightly ajar earlier in the evening while taking out the trash. The intruder moved quickly, way silently, bypassing the security cameras. Samantha, upstairs with Lily, noticed a faint movement in the hall outside her room. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but then she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. Her heart stopped. She grabbed the phone and called Daniel, whispering urgently. He was in the basement and immediately knew something was wrong. He sprinted upstairs, baseball bat in hand, and met the intruder in the living room. The intruder was wearing gloves, a mask, and a dark hoodie and carried a small crowbar. They lunged at Daniel, striking with surprising strength. A struggle ensued, violent and chaotic, with Daniel barely managing to hold the intruder at bay. Samantha, clutching Lily, screamed for help. The neighbors, alerted by the noise, called 911. The intruder realized the police were on their way and fled, disappearing into the night before anyone could catch them. The family was left shaken, bruised, and terrified, knowing that the person had been inside their home, holding their lives in their hands and could return at any time. The psychological impact was immediate. Daniel had nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, convinced he could hear footsteps in the house. Samantha became hypervigilant, checking every lock multiple times a night, and the baby cried more frequently, sensitive to their tension. Every visitor, every delivery person, every unfamiliar sound triggered panic. Weeks turned into months. The Hensleys moved furniture to block windows, installed motion sensors, and even considered relocating, but the trauma lingered. They spoke little to friends or family, afraid of judgment or disbelief. The local police continued to patrol the neighborhood more frequently, but the intruder was never caught, leaving an ever-present sense of dread. One evening, Daniel was working late from home, editing reports on his laptop in the living room. Samantha was in the kitchen preparing dinner, Lily playing quietly nearby. Suddenly, the security alarm triggered. Daniel rushed to the monitors and saw a shadow move across the backyard camera. The intruder had returned, this time seemingly more brazen, testing their defenses again. Daniel and Samantha huddled together, trying to remain calm, listening to the faint sound of the intruder outside. They knew that any confrontation could be deadly, and that the intruder had nothing to lose. Hours passed before the shadow finally retreated, leaving behind a chilling reminder that safety was always temporary, and that the intruder could strike again at any moment. The home invasion changed everything. The Hensleys' sense of security, trust, and peace was forever altered. Even in the brightest daylight, shadows seemed to linger, every creak of the house a potential threat. The community around them continued with normal life, oblivious to the terror that had unfolded. But for the Hensleys, every night carried the memory of a figure in the dark, a shadow that had infiltrated their home, their family, and their lives. Years later, the house still bore subtle reminders of that night, reinforced locks, security cameras, and even scars on the floors where furniture had been thrown during the struggle. The family spoke rarely of the events, and when they did, it was in hushed tones, the fear still palpable. The intruder was never caught, a ghostly presence haunting their memories, a warning that the safety of home is a fragile and precarious illusion. Even now, long after the events, Samantha and Daniel check locks obsessively, hesitate before answering doors, and never sleep with their bedroom door unlocked. Every unexpected noise in the house reignites the fear, a visceral reminder of that night when strangers invaded their sanctuary. For the Hensleys, the home would never feel truly safe again. Story the end. The evening started like any other. The sky had already darkened, early autumn settling into the town with a chill that pressed against the windows. I had been home alone for a few hours, my roommates gone for a weekend trip, leaving me with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old house as companions. At first, it felt peaceful. I poured myself a glass of wine, settled on the couch, and tried to focus on a show I'd seen a dozen times before. It was around 8:30 when I first noticed the subtle difference in the atmosphere. The kind of difference you can't immediately put your finger on, an almost tangible tension that seemed to curl through the air. I shrugged it off at first, blaming my imagination and the eerie calm that always seems to settle when a house is empty. But then I saw it. The shadow at the edge of the yard, a figure crouched low near the fence, watching the house. I froze, holding my wine glass midair. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I blinked, thinking perhaps I was seeing things. When I looked again, it was still there, and for the first time, a deep, primal fear clamped down on my chest. I went to the window to get a better look, pressing my hand to the glass, but all I could see was the vague outline of someone lingering, waiting. I immediately checked the locks on all doors and windows. Deadbolts clicked into place, but the unease didn't fade. Every shadow inside the house seemed to stretch toward me, every creak of the floorboard a warning. I tried to distract myself with the television, but the images on the screen blurred. My eyes kept darting to the windows, my mind tracing every possible way someone could get inside. Around 9, a tapping sound came from the back door. Soft, irregular, deliberate. My stomach dropped. I had locked that door. I had checked it twice. I moved toward the kitchen cautiously, gripping the heavy lamp by the base as a makeshift weapon. The tapping stopped, then started again, this time more insistent. I could hear the faint scrape of something against the frame. Someone was testing the lock. My phone shook in my hand as I dialed 911, whispering my address and my situation into the line. The dispatcher's calm voice was a thin tether to reality as I pressed my back against the wall, listening. The tapping stopped. Silence fell over the house, thick and oppressive, until another sound reached my ears. The soft, deliberate click of the front doorknob. I froze. The front door was deadbolted. Someone was trying to open it anyway. My pulse throbbed in my temples. I considered fleeing, but the thought of leaving the house open and vulnerable filled me with dread. I edged toward the stairs, gripping the lamp, listening to the sounds below. The intruder was moving carefully, checking the rooms methodically, the sound of footsteps on hardwood deliberate and slow. The voice came next, a low, grating tone that called out asking if anyone was home. My breath caught. I whispered into the phone, telling the dispatcher exactly what was happening. My eyes darted to the kitchen knife block, weighing whether it would be safer than the lamp. I could hear drawers opening, the soft scraping of furniture being moved. It wasn't random. It was precise, like the intruder had a plan and was following it. I bolted upstairs to my bedroom, slamming the door and locking it. I grabbed the heaviest object within reach and pressed myself against the wall, trying to appear invisible, trying to disappear from a house that no longer felt like mine. Every creak of the floor below made me flinch. Every shadow that fell across my window seemed to twist and grow. Then I remembered the attic. Small, cramped, but it could be a hiding place. I pulled at the hatch, forcing it open, and squeezed inside, the insulation prickling at my skin. From the small vent, I could see the intruder moving through the rooms, checking closets, rifling through drawers, their silhouette jagged in the dim light. My body pressed into the floor. I held my breath, praying not to be seen. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The dispatcher's voice occasionally came through the line, reminding me that police were on the way. I could hear them outside now, sirens faint at first, then closer, louder. The intruder froze, their attention drawn to the front of the house. I could hear them curse under their breath, the sound tense and sharp. Footsteps pounded as they ran toward the exit. Relief washed over me, but I stayed in the attic until I could hear the officers inside, checking every room. When it was over, the house was quiet again, but different. The intruder hadn't taken much, though only a few small electronics, but the violation lingered. The sense of safety, of sanctuary, had been shattered. I didn't stay. I moved out within a week, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, the paranoia that came with knowing someone had been inside my home, waiting, knowing my routines. Even now, years later, the fear remains. The faintest noise, a creak, a shadow, the scraping of metal, sets off a spike of adrenaline. Locks are checked obsessively, windows double-checked. The memory of that night is a permanent scar, a reminder that safety is fragile, that a house is only as secure as the people inside it believe it to be. I can still see the figure at the edge of the yard, crouched, waiting. I can hear the scrape at the back door, the deliberate click of the knob. I can feel the suffocating presence, the realization that home is not always a sanctuary, that terror can enter quietly, slowly, and with intent. The psychological aftermath was more than I expected. I had survived, but the experience rewired my sense of security. I cannot sit in silence without my mind replaying that night, cannot walk through an empty house without imagining someone moving just out of sight. Friends tell me it's irrational, that it's over, but the fear is persistent. It's intimate. It's personal. Every house I have lived in since has been fortified, every entry point examined, every noise scrutinized. I carry weapons now, not out of paranoia, but necessity, a defense against the possibility that someone could return. The memory of that night is an ever-present reminder. Luck is temporary, safety is fragile, and fear, once encountered, never fully leaves. Even writing this, I feel the cold grip of panic tightening. The mind remembers the way the intruder moved, the deliberate searches, the low, grating voice. I can see myself in that attic, clinging to a phone and a lamp, waiting, hoping. That fear is permanent. It lives in the corners of my perception, coloring my instincts, shaping my behavior. I tell the story, but it rarely translates. People hear the words, but they do not feel the terror, the intimacy of being hunted in your own home. They do not know what it is to hear the locks being tested, the doors being jostled, to feel the presence of someone with malicious intent just feet below. They do not understand the psychological imprint left behind. I moved far away from that neighborhood, but the memory followed. Every unfamiliar sound, every stranger's glance, every shadow at night triggers a visceral reaction. I live with vigilance, with constant awareness. I know I will never feel completely safe again, and that knowledge is a permanent companion. The experience taught me the fragility of security, the vulnerability of home, and the raw, unfiltered power of fear. Locks, alarms, and doors are only as good as the luck you have and the determination of someone who wants to violate your space. I have learned to respect that fear, to plan for it, to live with it, because it is now part of who I am. Even now, the thought of that night makes my pulse quicken. I remember the shadow at the fence, the tapping at the door, the deliberate search through my home. I remember the attic, cramped and dusty, my hands clutching a lamp, my phone pressed to my ear. That night shaped my perception of the world, my sense of home, and my understanding of danger. I have never forgotten the terror, and I never will. Home invasion is not just a story. It is an intimate violation, a piercing of the boundaries that we assume are safe. Once that boundary is crossed, the fear never truly fades. It lingers in the memory, in the shadows, in the sound of locks clicking and doors being tested. I live differently because of it. I lock every door multiple times, I check windows, I keep weapons close, I cannot undo the night, cannot erase the memory, cannot return to the sense of naive security I once had. The intruder, the methodical search, the low voice calling out, it is etched into my psyche, a permanent scar, a reminder of how fragile safety really is. Even years later, I sometimes hear the faintest tapping, the softest creak, and for a heartbeat, I am back in that living room, the figure at the edge of the yard, the back door being tested, my heart racing, clutching a lamp and a phone, waiting. The terror is still real, still sharp, still alive. I tell myself I survived. I tell myself I got lucky, but I also know how thin that line was, how close I came to something far worse. And that knowledge, the intimacy of that fear, will stay with me forever. Home is no longer just a place. It is a memory of what can happen when someone with intent crosses your threshold, when your sanctuary becomes a hunting ground. I carry that memory, that fear with me, always, a constant companion that will never leave. Story the end. The night was unremarkable at first, the kind of late autumn evening when the air outside is crisp and the inside of the house feels almost too quiet. A faint drizzle pattered against the windows, casting thin streaks of water that distorted the glow from the street lamps. The suburban street where Brian and Melissa lived was considered safe, tree-lined, filled with tidy houses, and far removed from the sort of crime stories people shook their heads at when they watched the local news. Brian had just settled into his recliner after locking up for the night, the sound of the deadbolt clicking shut, giving him that familiar comfort. Melissa was upstairs finishing a load of laundry, folding clothes on their bed, while the hum of the dryer echoed faintly down the hallway. Their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had been asleep for nearly an hour. Her bedroom door cracked open just enough so Melissa could peek in on her. It was routine. The house was predictable, and for years that predictability was part of why they chose to live there. Around 10:15, Brian muted the television. He thought he'd heard something, soft, almost imperceptible, like the faint crunch of gravel under weight. He frowned and tilted his head, holding his breath. The sound didn't come again. He told himself it was the rain, or maybe one of the neighborhood cats that liked to roam between yards at night. When he unmuted the television, the comfort of voices and canned laughter filled the silence again. Upstairs, Melissa paused as well. She thought she'd heard something too, a faint scrape against glass, like a fingernail dragged lightly along a window pane. She glanced toward Emma's room, her heart giving a little jump, but the child was undisturbed, breathing steadily in sleep. Melissa shook her head, chastising herself for being jumpy. The weather always seemed to play tricks on her ears. But at 10:32, the house's atmosphere shifted. Brian heard it first, the distinct sound of the side gate creaking open. His head snapped toward the window, but the curtains were drawn tight. He muted the television again, rising from the chair, his ears straining. Then came another sound, the unmistakable metallic rattle of the trash cans being nudged aside. "Melissa," he called softly, his voice just above a whisper, but he knew she probably couldn't hear him upstairs. He hesitated, debating whether to ignore it or to go check. A deep instinct inside him told him not to ignore it. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept leaning in the corner of the living room. A leftover habit from when he used to coach Emma's little league team, but lately it had served a different, more protective purpose. Melissa heard him moving around downstairs and came to the top of the stairs. "Brian, what is it?" she asked, her voice hushed, sensing his unease. "Stay up there," he said firmly. "I think someone's outside." Her stomach dropped, and she clutched the railing. "Are you serious?" He nodded, eyes fixed on the front door as though it might suddenly burst open. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, just as Melissa opened her mouth to say something else, a sound shattered the stillness, the sharp crack of glass breaking. It came from the kitchen window. Melissa stifled a scream, clapping a hand over her mouth. Brian's grip tightened on the bat, his pulse thundering in his ears. The house, which had moments before felt safe, now felt like a trap. "Go to Emma," Brian whispered fiercely. "Lock the door. Don't come out unless I tell you." Melissa nodded, tears already stinging her eyes, and rushed back toward their daughter's room. Brian crept toward the kitchen, his bare feet making no sound against the carpet. He could hear it now, the shuffle of someone climbing in through the broken window, glass crunching under their shoes. The intruder was trying to be quiet, but to Brian, the noises were deafening. The first glimpse he got was of a dark silhouette moving against the faint light of the kitchen nightlight. A man, broad-shouldered, wearing a hood, his gloved hands brushing shards of glass off the windowsill. Brian's heart leapt into his throat. This wasn't just someone snooping around outside. They were inside. Brian raised the bat slowly, every muscle trembling, but before he could act, the intruder froze. He turned his head toward the living room, as if sensing Brian's presence. For a moment, their eyes locked in the half-dark, though Brian couldn't see much beyond the glint of something metallic in the man's hand. A knife. The man smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was thin, cruel, like he was amused that Brian had caught him in the act. Brian's mouth went dry. He wanted to yell, to threaten the man, to tell him to get out, but his voice wouldn't come. Then another sound drifted down the stairs, a creak on the floorboards above as Melissa hurried to Emma's room. The intruder's grin widened. "There's more of you," the man said softly, his voice low and raspy, like gravel sliding over pavement. Brian lunged forward, swinging the bat with all his strength. The man darted back, the bat connecting with the edge of the counter instead, splintering wood. Before Brian could recover, the intruder slashed out with the knife, the blade grazing Brian's forearm. Pain seared through him, hot and sharp, but adrenaline kept him moving. They circled each other in the dim kitchen like breaths coming fast, bodies tense. Upstairs, Melissa locked Emma's door and pushed the dresser in front of it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She pressed her ear to the wood, hearing the muffled chaos below, the thuds, the crashes, the guttural grunts of struggle. She whispered to Emma, who had woken up terrified, "It's okay, baby. It's okay. Mommy's here." But Melissa knew it wasn't okay. Someone was in the house, fighting with her husband, and she had no idea how many of them there might be. Downstairs, the intruder feinted toward the hallway, drawing Brian's attention, then shoved him hard into the wall. Brian's shoulder slammed against the drywall with a crack, but he refused to let go of the bat. He swung again, this time grazing the man's ribs. The intruder grunted, staggering back a step. Then Brian heard it, a second set of footsteps crunching over broken glass. His blood turned to ice. There wasn't just one intruder. Another man emerged from the shadows of the kitchen doorway. Taller, leaner, but just as menacing, with a crowbar in his grip. He surveyed the scene and smirked. "Told you it'd be easy," he muttered to his partner. Brian's heart sank. Two of them. He couldn't take on both. Upstairs, Melissa heard the new voice and bit back a sob. She clutched Emma tighter, her mind racing. The phone. She had to call 911. She scrambled to grab her cell from the nightstand, her fingers fumbling as she dialed. The operator answered quickly, but Melissa barely managed to whisper out their address before the crash of furniture downstairs drowned out her voice. Brian fought with everything he had, swinging wildly, trying to keep the men from advancing toward the stairs. He knew what they wanted. Money, valuables, maybe the car. But he could see something darker in their eyes, something that made his stomach lurch. This wasn't just about theft. The man with the crowbar lunged, swinging it hard. Brian blocked with the bat, but the impact jolted through his arms, nearly knocking it loose. The knife wielder took the chance to slash again, this time cutting into Brian's side. He cried out, collapsing to one knee, vision blurring. "Brian!" Melissa screamed from upstairs before she could stop herself. Both intruders froze, looking up toward the sound. That was when the siren of a police car wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder. Melissa's 911 call had gone through. Relief surged in her chest, but it was short-lived. The intruders exchanged a look. The taller one snarled, "We don't have time for this. Grab what you can." But the one with the knife shook his head, his eyes gleaming with a twisted hunger. "No," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "We finish what we started." Melissa's blood ran cold. The men turned their attention to the stairs, but Brian, bleeding and gasping, used the last of his strength to swing the bat into the taller man's leg. The crack of bone echoed in the kitchen, and the intruder howled in pain, collapsing. The other man roared in fury and lunged at Brian, stabbing down. The front door burst open before the blade could land. Two police officers rushed in, guns drawn, shouting commands. The intruders froze, caught off guard. In the chaos that followed, one dropped his weapon and bolted through the broken kitchen window, disappearing into the night. The other, limping and cursing, was tackled to the ground and handcuffed. Melissa flung open Emma's door and rushed downstairs, tears streaming down her face. She collapsed beside Brian, who was pale and shaking, his shirt soaked with blood. "It's okay," she sobbed, clutching his hand as officers secured the scene. "You're okay. You're okay." Brian tried to smile, his voice a weak rasp. "I told you, stay upstairs." Paramedics arrived minutes later, lifting him onto a stretcher. Melissa and Emma followed, refusing to let go of his hand until the ambulance doors closed. The house, once their sanctuary, was left behind in shambles, broken glass, bloodstains, overturned furniture. The safety they had taken for granted was shattered forever. In the weeks that followed, Brian recovered slowly, though the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. Melissa couldn't sleep without double-checking every lock, every window, every shadow in the corners of the room. Emma had nightmares, waking up screaming that the bad men were coming back. The intruder who was caught refused to talk, his identity tied to other violent crimes in nearby towns. His partner was never found. The knowledge that one of them was still out there lingered like a poison in their minds. And every creak of the house at night, every brush of branches against the glass, every faint sound in the darkness, it all brought the memory flooding back, a reminder that their safe, ordinary home had once been invaded, and that it could happen again. Story, the end. It was just past midnight when Emma finally pulled into her driveway, the headlights of her aging sedan cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in over her small Ohio town. The street was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made every rustling leaf and distant dog bark feel amplified. She had been working the late shift at the local hospital, and all she wanted was a hot shower and bed. Her home, a modest two-story with faded siding and a small front porch, had always been her sanctuary. But tonight, as she turned the key in the lock, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. The door opened smoothly, and she stepped inside, immediately noticing a faint draft she couldn't explain. She had locked everything before leaving. She was meticulous about that, but something felt off. As she set her bag down and flicked on the lights, she noticed her living room chair was slightly out of place, angled in a way she was sure she hadn't left it. She paused, heart beginning to race. Maybe she had forgotten, maybe she had moved it earlier in the day. Her rational mind insisted it was nothing, but her gut screamed otherwise. She moved into the kitchen, planning to make a cup of tea to calm herself, and that's when she heard it, a soft creak from upstairs. Her stomach dropped. Her house was empty. She lived alone. Slowly, she turned toward the stairs, that straining to hear any repeat of the sound. There it was again, almost imperceptible, the slow groan of a floorboard under weight. Her mind raced. Burglars? Intruders? It didn't make sense. They would have broken a window, forced the door. She had checked them all, and yet the feeling that someone was up there persisted. Emma grabbed the small baseball bat she kept under the counter for emergencies. Her pulse was deafening in her ears as she climbed the stairs, each step deliberate and careful. At the top, she froze. The hallway was empty, the bathroom door closed, her bedroom door slightly ajar. That was impossible. She always closed it. She edged closer, and the hair on her arms stood on end. A faint scratching sound came from inside, slow, almost teasing. She pushed the door open slowly. Nothing. Her closet, her bed, her dresser, all exactly as she left them. Her pulse began to slow, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Then she noticed it. The window, the one she always locked, was unlocked, the latch slightly shifted. Emma's breath caught. She checked all the other windows. They were secure. The thought of someone being able to move around her home, silently, without leaving evidence, was terrifying. She called the police and explained the situation. They came quickly, but found nothing. "It's probably just the house settling," one officer said, though his eyes betrayed a hint of skepticism. Emma didn't feel comforted. The next few nights were sleepless. She installed a few inexpensive security cameras, placing them in the hallway, kitchen, and living room. At first, the footage showed nothing unusual, but Emma could feel it, the same way she felt the presence behind her the night she returned home. Shadows moved just a little differently. Noises sounded a touch too deliberate. One night, she checked the footage at 3:02 a.m. and froze. A dark figure moved down the hallway, slow, deliberate, almost gliding. It paused just out of view of the cameras, then disappeared. She replayed it several times, heart hammering. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been in her home. The police returned with renewed interest after seeing the footage. They searched thoroughly but found no signs of forced entry. No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing. They suggested a professional, someone skilled at slipping in and out without being detected. But Emma knew this was more than that. This was personal. Someone was watching her, studying her habits, learning her routines. The thought left her cold and shaking. Emma decided to leave for a few days, staying with her sister across town. The sense of safety returned somewhat, but it was fleeting. She dreamed of the figure, standing silently at the foot of her bed, whispering her name. Every sound in the house, every shadow, felt like a threat. When she returned home, she felt the same uneasy weight pressing down, as if her sanctuary had been tainted, forever changed. Weeks passed, and the intrusions became more audacious. Emma would come home to doors slightly ajar, furniture rearranged, and notes left in places only she would notice. One morning, she found a note on the kitchen counter. "I know you're alone tonight." Her blood ran cold. She called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, there was no one. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry. Emma started sleeping in the living room near the front door with a knife in one hand and her phone in the other. The nights became a terror-filled routine. She would hear footsteps upstairs, soft and deliberate, followed by silence. Doors would creak open and closed when no one was there. The smell of cigarette smoke, even though she didn't smoke, would drift through the air. Emma was slowly losing control, her mind fraying under the weight of constant fear. Friends tried to help, suggesting therapy, even a relocation, but she knew deep down that this was not something that could be escaped easily. Then, one particularly rainy night, everything escalated. She returned home, soaked from the downpour, and immediately noticed the sliding glass door had been opened slightly. Panic surged through her. She called the police while cautiously stepping inside, checking the house with a flashlight. The living room was untouched, but the sound of dragging from upstairs froze her in place. Her bedroom door, which she always kept locked, had been forced open. She moved slowly up the stairs, flashlight trembling in her hand. A shadow moved just out of reach of the light, disappearing into the hallway. Emma felt her chest tighten, every instinct screaming to run, but she pressed on, the terror mixed with a need to confront whoever had invaded her life. As she reached the top, the bathroom door opened slowly, creaking in a way that made her stomach churn. She swung the flashlight toward it, empty. But the whisper came, low, deliberate, chilling. "You can't hide." Emma ran down the stairs, back to the living room, where she had barricaded the door with a chair. She called 911 again, screaming into the phone, her voice shaking. The operator promised help, but it felt like hours before she heard sirens approaching. When the police arrived, there was no one, no footprints, no evidence. They found only the overturned chair, a note crumpled in the corner. "See you soon." After that night, Emma left the house permanently. She moved across state, purchasing a small apartment, hoping to escape the nightmare. She installed the most advanced security system she could afford, triple-checked every lock, and tried to rebuild her sense of normalcy. Yet, the feeling never left her. Shadows lingered at the edge of her vision. Every sound in the building made her flinch, and every breeze felt like a presence brushing past. She knew, even in this new place, that the intruder had not abandoned her. Months later, subtle signs began to appear in the new apartment. A picture slightly crooked, a chair moved, her keys misplaced. Notes were left, written in the same haphazard handwriting, "I'm still watching." Emma realized with a sickening clarity that this was not just about a house, it was about her. The intruder had followed, had adapted, had learned her patterns, and continued to terrorize her without ever being seen. The psychological toll was immense. Emma became hypervigilant, sleeping with weapons within reach, checking doors and windows multiple times before bed. She avoided going out alone at night, took longer routes to work, and started documenting every movement, every sound. Yet the fear was relentless. Every creak in the floor, every shadow shifting in the corner of her eye, every faint whisper in the darkness reminded her that she was being watched. One night, she woke to the sound of breathing in her bedroom. Her heart leapt into her throat. She grabbed the knife and scanned the room with the flashlight. Nothing. The sound stopped. She exhaled shakily, trying to convince herself it was her imagination. But then the whisper came again, unmistakable. "You can't escape me." The blood drained from her face. She realized then that the intruder was no longer bound by location. They had become a presence, a constant, invisible predator who could invade her life wherever she was. Emma moved again, twice more, but the pattern persisted. The intrusions adapted to her, became more sophisticated, more invasive. Notes appeared in her mailbox, had items shifted in her apartment, subtle threats left where only she could find them. She reported every incident, but the police could offer no concrete solutions, no evidence, no suspects. Her life became a series of defensive measures, a constant vigilance against an unseen, unrelenting adversary. Years later, Emma lives in a fortified apartment building, surveillance cameras on every corner, alarms and locks of every kind. Yet she sleeps with one eye open, one hand on her phone, one on a weapon. The feeling of being watched is constant, like a shadow following her everywhere she goes. She has resigned herself to a life of fear, understanding that the intruder may never be caught, may never stop. Every sound, every shadow, every subtle movement could be them. And she knows with absolute certainty that somewhere, someone is still watching, waiting, patient, and relentless, knowing exactly where she is and when she is most vulnerable. She can never let her guard down, not for a second, not ever, because they are always out there and someday they will strike again. Story the end. It was just after midnight when Sarah Caldwell settled into the couch with a blanket and the last of her wine. Her husband, Mark, was out of town for work, and the house felt too quiet without him. She had left a lamp glowing dimly in the corner, and the television was muted, its screen flickering soft light across the room. The dog, Daisy, a sleepy golden retriever, dozed at her feet. Sarah had always liked these calm, late-night hours when the rest of the neighborhood seemed asleep, but tonight that calm felt fragile, like something hovering just out of reach. The storm had rolled in earlier than expected. Heavy rain lashed against the windows, wind rattled the branches of the old oak in the yard, and thunder rumbled low in the distance. Every now and then, a flash of lightning illuminated the backyard through the sliding glass doors. Sarah tugged the blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to convince herself it was nothing unusual. She stood, stretched, and locked the back door out of habit. The metal clicked loudly in the stillness, and Daisy lifted her head, ears perked for a moment before settling back down. Sarah smiled at the dog's laziness. She checked the front door too, sliding the chain into place even though she already knew it was locked. A small ritual to help her relax. But when she turned to head upstairs, she thought she heard something, faint, deliberate. It was different from the storm. It was softer, closer, almost like the creak of a step on wood. She froze, listening. Daisy raised her head again, eyes fixed toward the front of the house. Probably the wind, Sarah whispered to herself, though the words carried no conviction. She tried to brush it off, but then came another sound. Slow, heavy, measured footsteps. Upstairs. Her heart seemed to stop. She lived alone with Mark. No one else should be upstairs. Daisy gave a low growl. The sound chilled Sarah more than anything, because the dog rarely growled. She moved carefully, quietly into the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife she could find from the block. She clutched it in trembling hands, trying to quiet her own breathing so she could hear. Another creak followed, then a pause. Whoever was up there was aware of her. She thought about calling the police, but her phone was still on the couch in the living room, right by the stairs that led up. To get it, she'd have to move closer to the sound. She considered leaving the house altogether, running barefoot into the rain. But what if she opened the door only to run right into whoever had broken in? The floor above her groaned. She could picture the layout. The hallway, the bedrooms, the bathroom. Her mind scrambled, imagining a man standing in the darkness of her room, going through her things, waiting. Daisy suddenly barked sharply, the sound so loud it startled Sarah. The bark echoed, and then the footsteps upstairs stopped. Absolute silence followed, pressing in around her. Sarah forced herself to inch toward the living room, knife raised, trying to make no sound. She reached the couch, grabbed her phone, and retreated back into the kitchen, where she could see both the front and back doors. Her hands shook as she unlocked her phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, calm and professional. Sarah whispered, "Someone's in my house. Upstairs. I heard them." The operator told her to stay on the line, to stay quiet, and that officers were being dispatched. But just as Sarah was nodding and clutching the phone, something made her blood run cold. A new sound. Gentle scraping came from the staircase. She turned her head slowly. From her spot in the kitchen, she had a partial view of the stairs. Daisy was standing rigid now, teeth bared. Another creak followed, deliberate, slow. Sarah couldn't see the intruder yet, but she knew they were coming down. "Please hurry," she whispered into the phone. "Stay where you are," the operator said. "Help is on the way." But Sarah wasn't sure she could just stay. The house suddenly felt like a trap. There was no time to plan, no time to think. She watched as a shadow appeared on the wall near the staircase, stretching in the dim lamplight. Someone was there. Her mouth went dry as her eyes locked on the shape of a figure descending, one step at a time. She couldn't see a face, only the outline of a tall man, broad shoulders, moving with chilling patience. Daisy lunged forward suddenly, barking furiously. The man froze, his shadow still. Then, in a low voice, he spoke, and Sarah felt her heart seize. "Quiet down, girl." It was the casualness of it that terrified her. This wasn't a panicked burglar. This was someone comfortable, someone who had planned. The operator kept speaking into her ear, but Sarah barely registered the words. She could only stare as the intruder finally stepped fully into view. He wore dark clothes, soaked as though he'd been outside in the rain. A ski mask covered his face. His right hand held something metallic, a crowbar. His eyes, visible through the mask, locked onto Sarah. She raised the knife instinctively, her voice trembling. "Get out! The police are coming!" He tilted his head, studying her. Then, without a word, he moved another step closer. Daisy charged at him, barking wildly. The man swung the crowbar, striking the floor near her. She yelped and scrambled back, tail tucked. Sarah screamed, brandishing the knife, but the man seemed unfazed. The operator was yelling now, telling her not to engage to get somewhere safe. But there was nowhere safe. He was between her and the stairs, and the front door was too far. Sarah backed into the kitchen further, toward the back door. Her hands shook so badly the knife rattled against the counter as she tried to keep it raised. The man advanced slowly, deliberately, his boots heavy against the floor. He didn't rush. He seemed to enjoy the terror. Her hands scrambled for the lock on the sliding glass door, but the rain outside blurred her vision. Her fingers slipped. She fumbled desperately, but he was already only feet away. Then Daisy lunged again, snapping at his leg. This time she clamped down, growling viciously. The man cursed loudly, kicking at the dog. Sarah took the chance. She yanked the sliding door open and bolted into the storm. Rain pummeled her face, plastered her hair to her skin, but she didn't stop. Barefoot, she ran across the soaked grass, slipping in the mud. Behind her, she heard shouting, Daisy barking, and then the slam of the sliding door. He was chasing her. She sprinted toward the neighbor's house, the one with the porch light still faintly glowing. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she forced herself forward. She screamed as she reached the porch, pounding on the door. Lights flicked on inside, and the neighbor, an older man named Mr. Harding, opened the door in shock. Sarah practically shoved her way inside, crying, shaking, trying to explain. But before Mr. Harding could even call out, the sound of footsteps splashed up the porch steps. The man was there. Mr. Harding barely had time to react before the masked intruder swung the crowbar at the doorframe. The wood splintered, but the older man shoved the door shut with all his strength, locking it. Sarah collapsed against the wall, sobbing, clutching her phone. The operator's voice still crackled in her ear. "Ma'am, officers are outside your street now. Stay inside. Stay hidden." Red and blue lights began flashing through the storm. Sirens wailed closer. The pounding on the neighbor's door stopped suddenly. By the time the police stormed the yards with flashlights and weapons drawn, the masked man was gone, vanished into the storm. Sarah shook uncontrollably as officers questioned her, as Daisy whimpered at her side. She told them everything she saw, every word he said, but the rain had washed away most tracks and no one saw where he went. That night, Sarah couldn't go back to her own home. She stayed with Mr. Harding until Mark returned. Even then, she never truly felt safe again, because the police never found him. And sometimes, late at night, Sarah swore she still heard footsteps upstairs, waiting for her to notice. Story the end. The first thing Daniel noticed that night was how silent the house felt once the television clicked off. He had fallen asleep on the couch, his head tilted uncomfortably against the armrest, and the glow from the screen had been the only light in the living room. When it went dark, he woke up suddenly, disoriented, his heart thumping from that small jolt of confusion. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, listening. The refrigerator hummed faintly from the kitchen, and he could hear the faint tick of the old wall clock in the hallway. Outside, the wind pushed against the siding and made the loose gutter creak. It was just after 1:30 a.m. He checked his phone to be sure. He considered going up to bed, but something in the stillness made him hesitate. He lived alone now. His divorce had finalized 6 months ago, and his ex-wife and daughter had moved 2 towns over. He kept telling himself he liked the solitude, that it was a chance to reset his life, but the empty nights weighed on him more than he wanted to admit. Tonight that loneliness pressed in harder than usual. He rubbed his face and pushed himself off the couch. He was halfway to the stairs when he heard it. A faint click, metal against metal, like a doorknob being tested. He froze. For a moment he thought it was his imagination, just one of those noises houses made at night when you were overtired and jumpy. But then it came again, clearer this time, from the back of the house where the kitchen door led out to the yard. Daniel's body tensed. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, straining his ears. There it was again, a slight metallic jiggle, then stillness. He felt his mouth go dry. He knew the sound too well. Someone was at his back door. He backed up a few steps and grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the staircase. He had bought it after the separation, not because he was a big fan of the game, but because it felt like something solid to hold in case the world suddenly turned on him. Now, gripping it, he wished he had gotten something heavier, sharper. His pulse hammered as he crept toward the kitchen. The small hallway that led there was dark, and he hadn't turned on any lights. He didn't want whoever it was outside to know he was awake. The air in the house felt colder suddenly, though the thermostat read 70. His bare feet were almost silent on the hardwood. When he reached the end of the hall, he pressed himself against the wall and listened. The knob moved again, slowly, carefully, as if someone didn't want to be heard. Then the faint scrape of metal, tools. Whoever it was wasn't just testing the door. They were trying to open it. Daniel's stomach sank. This wasn't a drunk neighbor who had gotten turned around. This wasn't some kid messing around. This was someone intent on getting inside. He thought about calling the police, but his phone was still on the coffee table in the living room. To get it, he'd have to backtrack. And he couldn't shake the fear that if he left the hallway, the intruder would succeed in opening the door before he could even dial. The scraping stopped. Silence pressed in so heavy he could hear his own breathing. Then came a faint thud, low and dull, as if the figure outside had leaned against the door, listening. Daniel's throat tightened. He tightened his grip on the bat and leaned forward just enough to peek into the kitchen. Through the glass pane of the back door, he saw movement, a shadow shifting, blocking the faint porch light. Someone was standing there, just inches from his warm, safe kitchen. His first instinct was to shout, to let them know he was there, to scare them off. But something held him back. A feeling. A chill. This wasn't someone who would run just because the homeowner yelled. This person was patient, determined. For several minutes, nothing happened. Daniel stayed pressed against the wall, muscles locked, the bat slick in his sweaty hands. Then the shadow shifted again, retreating slightly. He thought maybe they were giving up, but instead, a faint crunch of gravel told him they were moving around the side of the house. He bolted back into the living room, snatched his phone off the table, and ducked low, crouching behind the couch as he dialed 911. His whisper came out hoarse. "Someone's trying to break into my house." The operator's calm voice steadied him slightly, but not much. She asked for his address, his name, if he could see the intruder now. He whispered answers as quickly as he could, flinching when another sound echoed through the house, a sharp rattle from the front door this time. The intruder was circling, trying different entry points. "They're at the front door now," Daniel whispered. The operator assured him officers were on the way and told him to stay on the line. He gripped the phone against his ear, heart hammering so hard he thought it would shake the couch. The rattling stopped again. Silence. He waited, listening so hard his head hurt. Then came a faint scratching. Windows. The bastard was testing the windows now. Daniel's panic surged. He crept along the floor toward the stairs. If he could get to the upstairs bathroom, he could lock himself in until the police arrived. He moved as quietly as possible, but every creak of the floorboards felt like a gunshot. Halfway up the stairs, he froze again. From below came a sound that made his blood turn to ice. The unmistakable groan of a window sliding open. He clutched the bat tighter, his hand trembling. The operator's voice came softly through the phone, asking if he was still there. He whispered, "They're inside." The silence after that stretched long. He could hear nothing at first, then the soft pad of footsteps against his living room floor. Slow, deliberate, careful. Daniel's entire body shook. He held his breath, his chest aching with the effort not to make a sound. The footsteps moved deeper into the house. A faint rustle, the sound of something brushing against the coffee table. He crawled the rest of the way up the stairs, praying the old wood wouldn't betray him. Once at the top, he slipped into the bathroom and shut the door as quietly as possible, turning the lock with trembling fingers. He crouched against the wall, clutching the bat in one hand and the phone in the other. The operator kept speaking softly, telling him officers were only minutes away. Minutes felt like an eternity. Downstairs, the footsteps moved steadily through the house. He could hear drawers being slid open, the faint clink of something metallic. The intruder was searching. Then the sound shifted. The footsteps began climbing the stairs. Daniel's entire body went rigid. His breath hitched painfully in his chest. He whispered into the phone, "They're coming upstairs." The operator urged him to stay quiet, to remain calm. But calm was impossible. The sound of those footsteps, slow, unhurried, confident, was the most terrifying thing he'd ever heard. They paused halfway up. A silence stretched long and deliberate as if the intruder was listening. Then the steps resumed, closer, heavier now. Daniel's eyes darted to the bathroom door. The thin wood suddenly looked far too fragile, like a paper barrier. He imagined the knob turning, the door swinging inward, a dark figure filling the frame. The steps reached the top of the stairs. For a moment they stopped completely. Then came the creak of a floorboard just outside the bathroom. Daniel held his breath so hard his chest burned. He raised the bat, his hands trembling violently. The knob rattled once, sharply. He nearly dropped the bat. Then silence again. Seconds stretched. He could hear his own blood pounding in his ears. Then faintly he heard another sound. Sirens, distant but growing louder. The footsteps retreated. A sudden burst of movement, the sound of someone running down the stairs, then the slam of the front door. Daniel didn't move until he heard the heavy boots of officers pounding through the house, their voices shouting for him to come out. Only then did he unlock the bathroom and stumble into the hallway, his legs shaking so badly he nearly collapsed. The officers found signs of forced entry at the back window. They searched the house, but the intruder was gone, vanished into the night. Daniel gave his statement as best he could, though his thoughts were scattered. The officers assured him they would patrol the neighborhood, keep an eye out. They told him he was lucky. But luck was not what Daniel felt as he stood in his own hallway, staring at the shadows pooling in the corners of his home. He felt violated, hunted. His safe, quiet house had been breached, and he knew with bone-deep certainty that the intruder hadn't just been looking for valuables. Whoever it was had taken their time, testing every point of entry, moving with patience. That patience told Daniel something he couldn't shake. They hadn't been after his things. They had been after him. Even with police outside, he couldn't bring himself to sleep in the house that night. He sat in his car with the doors locked until dawn came, gripping the bat in his lap, waiting for the sun to prove the night was over. But as he sat there, exhausted and hollow, one thought kept circling in his mind, chilling him to his core. Whoever had come into his home had known exactly what they were doing, and they would know how to do it again. And next time, they might not leave when the sirens came. Story the end. The house sat at the edge of a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, tucked behind a cluster of oak trees whose bare branches clawed against the gray February sky. The neighborhood wasn't the type where people locked their doors religiously, though most homeowners did anyway. It was the sort of place where kids still played outside until the streetlights came on, where neighbors waved when they passed in their cars, and where the loudest sounds at night were usually just barking dogs or the occasional siren on the main road. But to Emily and her husband Ryan, the house was more than just another suburban box. It was their first real home. Emily had been cautious since they moved in 3 months earlier. She kept the blinds closed at night, double-checked the locks before bed, and left a porch light burning until morning. Ryan teased her about it, but she shrugged it off. Growing up in Chicago had made her wary, and even though they'd moved to a small town in Indiana where crime was nearly non-existent, the habits stuck. That Friday night was ordinary, at least at first. Ryan was stretched out on the couch watching a late basketball game with a beer in his hand. Emily sat in the recliner beside him with her laptop balanced on her knees, half working on a freelance project while absently scrolling social media. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to glowing embers, and the hum of the furnace filled the silence between commercials. Around 10:45, Emily yawned and shut her laptop. "I'm heading to bed," she said. "You staying up?" "Yeah, just until the game's over," Ryan replied, eyes glued to the TV. She leaned down, kissed the top of his head, and padded down the hallway to their bedroom. She brushed her teeth, changed into a sweatshirt and leggings, and slid under the covers. She had just turned off the lamp when she heard something outside. It was faint, a sound that could have been anything. Maybe the wind rattling a loose gutter or a stray cat nosing around the trash cans. She told herself it was nothing and closed her eyes. Then it came again. A deliberate crunch of footsteps on the frozen ground just below the bedroom window. Emily's eyes flew open, and she lay rigid in the dark, holding her breath. The sound stopped for several seconds, then resumed, slower this time, like someone trying not to be heard. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her thumb hovering over Ryan's contact. Instead, she quietly slipped out of bed, crept to the door, and poked her head into the hallway. From the glow of the TV, she could see Ryan still lounging on the couch. "Ryan," she whispered sharply. He glanced back. "What? Come here." Her voice cracked enough that he sat up, muted the game, and walked over. "What is it?" She motioned toward the window. "Someone's outside." He frowned. "You sure? Probably just a raccoon." "I know what I heard," she said. They stood there for a moment in silence, straining their ears. At first, nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of their side gate squealing open. Ryan stiffened. He turned off the TV, plunging the living room into darkness, and moved quietly to the kitchen window. Peeking out between the blinds, he whispered, "There's a guy out there." Emily's chest tightened. "What's he doing?" Ryan didn't answer at first. Then, "He's just standing there, right by the garage." Her phone shook in her hand as she unlocked it. "I'm calling the cops." "Wait," Ryan said, his hand on her wrist. "He hasn't done anything yet. He's in our yard." But before they could argue further, there was a new sound, the distinct scrape of metal against metal. It came from the back door. Emily's heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. Ryan grabbed the heavy flashlight they kept in the kitchen drawer, his face pale in the dim glow of the stove clock. The back doorknob jiggled once, then again, harder. Emily gasped, clutching Ryan's arm. "Call 911, he whispered. Her voice trembled as she relayed their address to the dispatcher, whispering frantically that someone was trying to break in. The operator told her to stay on the line, keep quiet, and find a safe place. Ryan motioned for her to move toward the hallway. But before they could take more than a few steps, the sharp crack of shattering glass echoed through the house. It came from the laundry room window. Emily let out a small scream, which Ryan quickly muffled with his hand. They ducked into the hallway, just as the sound of heavy boots crunched across the tile floor. Someone was inside. Ryan guided Emily quickly into the bedroom, shutting the door softly behind them. He whispered for her to stay hidden, then grabbed his baseball bat from under the bed. "Ryan, don't," she begged, her grip tight on his sleeve. But he shook her off. "I'm not letting him walk through our house." The floorboards creaked in the living room. Whoever had broken in was moving slowly, deliberately, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. Ryan stepped back into the hallway, bat raised, as Emily crouched in the corner with her phone clutched to her chest. The dispatcher's calm voice echoed in her ear, saying officers were on their way. She heard Ryan's footsteps retreating down the hall, then the tense silence of the house. And then another voice. Male, not Ryan's. "You picked the wrong house," Ryan growled. A harsh laugh answered him. The next few seconds blurred into chaos. A crash, a grunt, the thud of something hitting the wall. Emily screamed, the phone slipping from her hand. She rushed into the hallway just in time to see Ryan wrestling with a masked man in the dim light. The intruder was bigger, stronger. His gloved hand clamped around Ryan's throat while the other swung a knife. Emily screamed again, grabbing the nearest thing she could find, a lamp from the console table, and hurled it. It smashed against the intruder's shoulder, making him stagger. Ryan broke free, gasping for air, and swung the bat with all his strength. The intruder stumbled back but didn't fall. His eyes glinted darkly through the holes in his ski mask as he raised the knife again. And then came another sound. Footsteps. More than one. Emily's blood ran cold. There wasn't just one intruder. 3 more figures emerged from the shadows of the living room, all wearing dark clothes and masks. "Oh my God," she whispered. Ryan pulled her back toward the bedroom, slamming the door and shoving the dresser in front of it. The intruders pounded against the wood, their muffled voices barking orders to one another. Emily's hands shook uncontrollably as she scrambled for the phone again. The line was still open, the dispatcher frantically asking if they were okay. She sobbed into the receiver, "They're inside! Please hurry!" The banging on the door grew louder, splintering the wood. Ryan braced the dresser with his shoulder, his knuckles white around the bat. And then, silence. The sudden stillness was worse than the pounding. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as they listened. The only sound was the shallow rasp of their own breathing. Then softly, a voice from the other side of the door. "You can't hide forever." Emily's heart nearly stopped. The next 30 minutes stretched into eternity. The intruders moved through the house, opening drawers, slamming cabinets, knocking things over. At one point, the sound of footsteps paused right outside the bedroom again, the doorknob rattling slowly. But the door held. Somewhere in the distance, faint at first but growing louder, came the wail of sirens. The intruders cursed. Heavy footsteps pounded across the floor, and then the back door slammed. Ryan held Emily tightly as the sound of sirens filled the street, red and blue lights flashing through the curtains. Police officers stormed in, weapons drawn, searching every room. But the intruders were gone, melted into the night before the first cruiser pulled up. The shattered window gaped open to the cold winter air. Drawers hung open, belongings scattered across the floor. Emily clung to Ryan, sobbing, as officers asked questions she barely heard. Even after the house was swarming with uniforms and flashing lights, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. And the words echoed in her head long after the officers left and the house fell quiet again. You can't hide forever. Story the end. It was a Friday evening in late October, and the fading sunlight cast a dull orange glow over the small suburban neighborhood of Maplewood, Ohio. Sarah Miller had just gotten home from work, exhausted from a 12-hour shift at the hospital. Her small house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least they thought they did. Maplewood was the kind of neighborhood where kids played in the streets until dusk, and people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and Sarah had always prided herself on feeling safe in her little corner of the world. That night, she arrived home around 7:30 p.m., the sky already streaked with bruised purples and dark clouds that hinted at an approaching storm. She fumbled with her keys at the door, the click of the lock echoing faintly in the quiet street. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a chill that made her pull her jacket tighter. Inside, the house smelled faintly of laundry detergent and leftover dinner. She dropped her bag on the counter and flopped onto the couch, ready to unwind. It had been one of those weeks where the stress seemed to seep into her bones, and all she wanted was the comfort of solitude. Sarah's cat, Whiskers, padded across the living room, tail high, before leaping onto her lap. She scratched behind his ears absently, scrolling through her phone when a sudden sharp noise made her freeze. It was the kind of noise that didn't belong, a soft, deliberate thump coming from the back of the house. She told herself it was probably just the wind, or maybe a branch hitting the window. But the more she tried to convince herself, the more her stomach knotted. Whiskers twitched his ears, his body stiffening. His fur bristled slightly. The cat's instincts were almost never wrong. "Okay, it's nothing," she whispered, standing up and moving toward the kitchen, peeking out the window that faced the backyard. Nothing. The trees swayed, the leaves rustled, and the occasional raindrop spattered against the glass, but there was no one there. Her heart rate slowed, and she laughed softly at herself. Stress. That's all it is. She tried to shake the feeling as she went about her evening, cooking a simple dinner and turning on the television. But deep down, a tiny voice nagged at her. A sense that she was being watched, that her home wasn't as empty as it should be. She called her best friend, Lisa, to chat while she ate, and the conversation helped distract her from the creeping unease. By the time she hung up, the sky had darkened completely, rain beginning to patter against the windows in steady sheets. She turned off the lights in the living room and retreated to her bedroom with Whiskers, curling up under the blankets with a book to calm herself before bed. Around 11:15 p.m., Sarah thought she heard a muffled sound downstairs, something akin to dragging or scraping. Her stomach dropped. She froze, listening, trying to tell the difference between the rain and whatever it was. The sound repeated, quieter this time, deliberate. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. She knew she should call the police, but part of her couldn't quite accept that someone would break into her small suburban home. Maybe it was an animal, a tree branch, anything but the horrifying truth. Then she heard the distinct sound of a door opening, not the front door, not the kitchen, but the sliding door that led to the backyard. Her eyes went wide as she realized that the lock was supposed to be engaged. She swallowed hard, heart hammering in her chest. She quietly reached for her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. The operator answered immediately, and she whispered the situation, trying to sound calm. "Stay on the line, ma'am. Do not confront the intruder. If you can, find a safe place to hide," the operator instructed. Sarah's gaze darted around the bedroom. She could hide in the closet, but the door didn't lock properly. The bathroom offered more privacy, and she could lock the door from the inside. She moved silently, trying not to alert whoever was in her house, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Whiskers hissed quietly, retreating to a corner of the bathroom. The sound of the intruder moving, soft thuds on the hardwood floor, was unmistakable now. Someone was inside. The minutes stretched endlessly. Sarah tried to control her breathing, but every creak, every groan of the old house made her flinch. She heard footsteps approaching her bedroom door, then stopping. Her blood ran cold. The operator on the phone instructed her to stay as quiet as possible and not make a sound. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping the person wouldn't notice the bathroom. The doorknob rattled, a cruel, deliberate twist that made her flinch. Then silence. She couldn't tell if they had gone upstairs, downstairs, or were just lingering outside her bedroom. Minutes felt like hours. Then came a soft, deliberate scraping sound, like someone dragging their fingers along the hallway wall. Sarah's mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Her house felt suddenly enormous and treacherous, every shadow a potential threat. She prayed the police would arrive quickly, and then the intruder spoke. Just one word, low and taunting. "Sarah." Her blood froze. Only someone who knew her name could call it like that. Her pulse raced as she realized that this wasn't random. This was personal. Her mind reeled, thinking of anyone who might hold a grudge. The operator's voice cut through her panic, calm and steady. "Stay where you are. Officers are on the way. Can you lock the door?" She fumbled with the bathroom lock, finally clicking it into place. The sound of footsteps retreating from her door filled her with a mixture of dread and temporary relief. She couldn't risk moving yet. She sat on the floor trying to make herself as small and quiet as possible. The rain outside hammered harder now, a torrential rhythm against the roof. Occasionally, she would hear a soft thump from the living room, like someone had set something down and then moved away. She wanted to scream, to run, but she knew any sound might give her location away. Then the power went out. The house was plunged into total darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning through the window. Her phone's battery was low, the screen barely illuminating the tiny bathroom. She clutched it tightly, willing it not to die. Whiskers was huddled against her leg, trembling. The fear was infectious, almost suffocating. Suddenly, the front door slammed open with a deafening crash. She heard voices, muffled and distorted by the storm. Two male voices arguing, rough and aggressive. One sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. Her stomach lurched. She didn't know if they were still in the house or just outside. She could hear them moving through the living room, opening cabinets, stepping over furniture. Her mind raced. If they found her, she was defenseless. She had no weapon, no plan, just the desperate hope that the police would arrive before it was too late. Then came a new sound, the unmistakable creak of the stairs. Someone was heading upstairs. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She moved silently to the far corner of the bathroom, trying to make herself invisible. The footsteps approached the second floor, slower now, cautious. She pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering so hard she thought they might hear it. The doorknob to her bedroom rattled again, the intruder clearly searching for her. They stopped outside for a moment, breathing audible. She dared not move. The operator whispered instructions through the phone, keeping her calm as best as possible. The storm outside intensified, masking some of the noises from the intruders. Sarah could hear them moving past her bedroom door, then down the hall. She held her breath, hoping, praying that they would leave before the police arrived. But then she heard it. The slow, deliberate steps coming back. They had found something, or perhaps were checking the entire floor. The minutes dragged painfully. Finally, sirens wailed in the distance. The sound was like a lifeline. The intruders froze. Then one of them cursed loudly, realizing help was arriving. Sarah heard the front door being kicked open again. The voices fled, retreating into the night as quickly as they had come. The sound of tires on wet pavement speeding away was the first indication that they were gone. She sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. The police arrived moments later, officers flooding the house with flashlights and guns drawn. Sarah answered their questions in a trembling voice, explaining everything she had heard and seen. They conducted a search of the house, finding signs of forced entry through the sliding door and a few items disturbed in the living room. Nothing had been stolen, and thankfully, she was unharmed physically. But the psychological toll was immense. She would never forget the way her name had been whispered, the sound of footsteps in her bedroom, the feeling of being hunted in her own home. In the following weeks, Sarah struggled with sleep. Every noise at night made her heart race, every creak of the old house a trigger for panic. She installed multiple locks, security cameras, and even a loud alarm system. Friends and family checked on her constantly, and she started carrying pepper spray everywhere, even inside her own home. Yet, despite all the precautions, the fear never fully left her. The sense of violation lingered, an invisible presence that reminded her that the world could be cruel and safety was never guaranteed. Months later, she received a call from the police. DNA evidence from the sliding door matched two men with extensive criminal records. They had been part of a small group responsible for a series of home invasions in the area. Neither had any personal connection to Sarah, but the fact that they had entered her home and known her name haunted her. The realization that she had narrowly escaped a much worse fate left her both grateful and terrified. Maplewood, once a haven, now felt like a place where danger could lurk behind any quiet street, any darkened window. Even years later, Sarah couldn't bring herself to walk down that cul-de-sac alone at night. The memory of that night, the sound of the intruders moving through her house, the whispered name, the darkness, the storm, and the suffocating fear remained vivid. She had survived, yes, but survival came with a cost. The lingering knowledge that her sanctuary had been breached, and the sense that she had been a target not for who she was, but for how easily someone could invade her life. The fear, the adrenaline, and the helplessness were feelings she would carry forever. Her life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of that night never left. Every sound in the house after dark made her flinch. Every unexpected knock at the door made her heart race. She learned to check locks 3 times, to double-check windows, and to keep her phone close at hand. Yet, no matter what precautions she took, the memory of strangers in her home, strangers who had called her by name, who had moved silently and deliberately through her rooms, who had vanished into the stormy night, leaving her shaken and alone, was indelible. Sarah never stopped looking over her shoulder. Every time she stepped inside her house, she felt the weight of that night pressing down on her, a reminder that the world could turn on you in a heartbeat, and safety was an illusion. She had survived the home invasion, but the terror had marked her permanently. It became a story she would recount to friends, a cautionary tale of vigilance, yet every retelling rekindled the fear, reminding her, and anyone who listened, that home, the place you think is safest, can become the setting of a nightmare. Story the end. It started on a quiet Thursday night, the kind of night when the wind barely stirred the leaves outside, and the occasional car passing down Elm Street was enough to break the eerie stillness. The Johnson family lived in a modest 2-story house, painted a pale blue, tucked between other similar suburban homes. Mark Johnson, a 34-year-old accountant, had just finished grading a pile of financial reports in his home office. He was looking forward to unwinding with his wife, Laura, and their 12-year-old daughter, Emily. Nothing about this evening suggested the terror that was about to unfold. Laura had spent the day preparing dinner while Emily was upstairs in her room, immersed in one of her favorite books. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic bread filled the air, a comforting reminder of normalcy. Mark closed his laptop, stretched, and called out for Emily to wash up for dinner. She replied from her room, her voice bright but distant. Everything seemed ordinary until Mark noticed the back door. He hadn't locked it. Not unusual, but in that small, uneasy moment, he felt a shiver run down his spine. He shrugged it off, telling himself he was just tired from work. Emily emerged from her room, brushing her hair, and they all sat down to eat, Laughter and chatter bounced around the kitchen, and Mark tried to shake off the feeling of unease. Then, just as he was about to pour himself another glass of wine, he heard a faint sound, a creak, almost imperceptible, coming from the hallway near the back of the house. He paused mid-pour, listening. The sound stopped. Maybe it was just the house settling, he thought. But then it happened again, a soft scrape followed by a barely audible shuffle. Mark's heart rate picked up. "Laura," he whispered, his voice low, "did you hear that?" Laura frowned, looking toward the hallway. "Hear what?" "Something. I don't know. Like a shuffle. Upstairs? Downstairs?" Mark couldn't pinpoint it. The warmth of the kitchen suddenly felt distant, replaced with a rising tension. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, but instinct told him otherwise. Mark excused himself from the table and moved toward the back of the house. The living room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights spilling through the blinds. As he walked toward the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, he froze. The door wasn't fully shut. His stomach dropped. Before he could reach for the handle, a voice whispered from the shadows behind him. Low, deliberate, and chilling. "Don't move." Mark spun around. The living room was empty. He called out, but only silence replied. Panic began to set in. He backed up slowly toward the kitchen. Every instinct screamed for him to grab something, anything, to defend himself. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy pepper grinder, and clutched it like a lifeline. "Mark, is everything okay?" Laura's voice trembled as she emerged from the kitchen, holding a knife she had grabbed instinctively. I think someone's here," he stammered. Suddenly, a figure lunged from the shadows near the hallway. Masked, towering, and armed, the intruder moved with terrifying precision. Mark swung the pepper grinder, connecting with the intruder's arm then, but it barely slowed him down. Laura screamed, dropping the knife in shock, and Emily's voice echoed from upstairs. "Daddy, what's happening?" Mark's eyes darted to the staircase. "Emily, get under the bed! Now!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The intruder swung a crowbar, narrowly missing Mark. The sound of shattering wood filled the air as the front door, which Mark had locked earlier, splintered under another unseen force. Panic surged as Laura grabbed a kitchen chair, swinging it at the intruder, who dodged effortlessly. Mark ran toward the garage, thinking to escape, only to find the door had been tampered with, locked from the outside. The house that had always been a sanctuary now felt like a trap. From upstairs, Emily's sobs made the adrenaline spike even higher. "Daddy! Please help me!" she screamed. Mark's mind raced. He knew he couldn't fight the intruder head-on, at least not without a plan. He whispered to Laura, "We have to get to Emily, then out the window. It's our only chance." They crept toward the staircase. Every step creaked. Every shadow seemed alive. The intruder's presence was palpable, a dark pulse in the house. They reached the staircase and peered upstairs. Emily was frozen on the landing, her small frame trembling. The intruder was behind her, his silhouette merging with the dim light. Mark took a deep breath and charged, throwing himself at the intruder. The struggle was immediate and brutal. The masked man was strong, his grip like iron. Laura screamed and tried to pull him off, but he shoved her back. Mark's hand found the intruder's knife, and he swung with all his strength. The knife clattered to the floor. In that brief moment, Emily bolted, crawling under her bed. Mark and Laura pinned the intruder against the wall, their combined weight almost enough to overpower him. But then another figure appeared, another masked intruder, entering from the back door that Mark had forgotten to lock. The realization hit them like a punch. They were not alone. The second intruder moved silently, like a predator circling its prey. Mark could see the glint of a gun in his hand. "Stay down," the man barked. Mark and Laura froze. The intruder raised the weapon, but before he could act, Mark hurled a heavy lamp at him. It struck his arm, and the gun clattered to the floor. Chaos erupted. The first intruder broke free and lunged toward them, while the second scrambled to retrieve his gun. Laura grabbed a kitchen knife and ran at the first intruder, managing to stab him in the shoulder. He roared in pain, but didn't stop. Mark's eyes darted toward the open front window. It was now or never. He grabbed Emily, pulling her out from under the bed. She clung to him, her small hands digging into his shirt. Laura followed, swinging the knife at the first intruder again. They reached the window and leapt onto the bushes below, thorns tearing at their clothes and skin, but the escape was worth it. They didn't stop running until they reached the neighbor's house. Panting, bleeding, and terrified, they banged on the door. The neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, opened it, eyes wide with shock. "Call the police," Mark shouted, his voice hoarse. Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the night. Police arrived, securing the house, searching every room, every corner. The intruders had vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only broken furniture, shattered glass, and the remnants of terror. In the days that followed, the Johnsons struggled to process what had happened. Friends and family offered support, but the psychological scars ran deep. Emily refused to sleep in her room, haunted by the memory of the intruders looming over her. Laura and Mark installed security cameras, reinforced locks, and even considered moving to a new home, though the idea of leaving their neighborhood was painful. The police never found the intruders, despite reviewing security footage and canvassing the neighborhood. The house that once felt safe now carried an unspoken dread. Every creak, every shadow, every unexpected sound triggered panic. Months later, Emily awoke in the middle of the night, convinced she heard footsteps in the hallway. Mark and Laura rushed to her room, hearts pounding. There was nothing there, yet the fear lingered, thick and unshakable. They realized that the home invasion didn't just shatter their sense of security, it had altered the very fabric of their lives. Even after installing alarms and cameras, nothing could erase the memory of that night. Every sound in the dark was a potential threat, every knock at the door a possible terror. The Johnsons learned to sleep with lights on, doors locked, and eyes wide open. Their home, once a sanctuary, had become a constant reminder that safety could never be guaranteed, that the darkness outside could hide unimaginable threats. Years later, the house remained on Elm Street, quiet on most nights, but Mark, Laura, and Emily never forgot. The fear had seeped into their bones, a permanent shadow. They had survived the night, but the memory lingered like an uninvited guest, waiting for the next moment of vulnerability, the next creak in the hallway. The invaders had disappeared, but the terror they left behind had become a permanent resident in their lives. Even when the sun rose and the world seemed safe again, the Johnsons knew better. Safety was an illusion, and the shadows were always watching, always waiting. Story the end. The first time it happened, Jenna thought she was imagining things. She was lying on the couch in her small, two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, a half-empty bowl of popcorn on the coffee table, the glow of the television casting shadows against the walls. It was just past midnight. The streets outside were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than silence itself. She'd been up late, trying to catch up on work after a long day at the hospital. Her boyfriend, Marcus, had been out of town for a week, and she had the apartment to herself. She told herself it was nothing, just the creaks of an old building settling. The first sound she noticed was a faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood, coming from the back of the apartment near the kitchen. Her heart picked up, and she paused the movie, holding her breath. "Probably the fridge," she muttered to herself, even though the refrigerator had been humming steadily all evening. The scratching continued, irregular, sometimes soft, sometimes louder, like someone testing the floorboards. Jenna set down the remote, telling herself to get up and check it out. As she stood, the couch sagged under her weight, and she felt a chill creep down her spine. The apartment was small enough that she could see the kitchen from the living room, and she strained her eyes in the darkness. There was nothing. She flipped the switch, and the overhead light buzzed to life. The kitchen was empty. She exhaled slowly, but the unease didn't leave her. She double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, convincing herself she was being paranoid. She returned to the couch, but the scratching started again, this time from the hallway that led to her bedroom. Her pulse quickened. She debated calling Marcus, but the phone felt heavy in her hand. She reminded herself there was no logical reason for someone to be in her apartment. Columbus wasn't exactly the kind of city where home invasions happened frequently, especially in her quiet neighborhood. Yet the sound persisted, subtle but deliberate, like someone pacing just out of sight. She crept toward the hallway, every step careful, her heart hammering in her chest. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, though she was certain she had closed it. A cold draft brushed against her face as she pushed it open. Nothing. Just the dim glow of the streetlight outside filtering through the blinds. She shook her head, feeling a flicker of shame for letting her imagination get the better of her. She went back to the couch, locked the door behind her, and tried to force herself to watch the movie. But sleep didn't come that night. Over the next week, the scratching returned. Sometimes it was at the kitchen, sometimes the hallway, sometimes the living room walls themselves seemed to whisper. Jenna tried to rationalize it, pipes, old building noises, maybe even the wind, but the pattern became unsettlingly consistent. The noises always happened when she was alone, always at night, always in places where she knew she had locked the doors. She began to set up little tests. She would lock herself in the bedroom and leave the TV running in the living room to see if the sound came. Inevitably, it did. One Thursday evening, she was curled up in bed scrolling through her phone when she heard it again, the scratching, but this time accompanied by a faint creak of a floorboard outside her bedroom door. She froze, listening. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly, deliberately, and they were close. Her phone slipped from her hands. She pressed herself against the wall, heart thundering, barely daring to breathe. A low, guttural noise followed, a whisper almost too quiet to make out. She couldn't tell if it was a voice or some sort of sound the person made to mask their presence. Jenna remembered the baseball bat Marcus kept in the closet. She inched toward it, every nerve in her body screaming. The handle was cold in her hands as she gripped it tightly. She strained to hear any other movement. Then silence. A suffocating, heavy silence. Her instincts told her to stay put until morning, but her curiosity, or perhaps her fear of appearing irrational, pushed her forward. She edged toward the door, swung it open a crack, and looked into the dark hallway. A shadow flickered. Not her imagination this time. She gasped and stumbled back into the room, pressing the bat to her chest. The shadow moved again, just at the edge of the light, spilling from her bedroom. She froze, waiting, and that's when she saw the reflection in the mirror across from her door. A figure crouched at the far end of the hallway, facing her, almost perfectly still. It was tall, lanky, and dressed entirely in black. Its eyes glinted faintly in the dim light, as if it was savoring the moment, relishing the fear it had created. She screamed, raising the bat and swinging it at the figure. The movement startled it, but instead of running, it lunged toward her. She fell back, knocking over the nightstand, and the figure froze for a moment, then darted toward the living room. She bolted after it, calling 911 as she ran, but by the time the police arrived, the intruder had vanished. Nothing was stolen, but the apartment felt violated in a way she couldn't describe. Every locked door, every window seemed like a fragile barrier against someone who had already shown they could get inside. Jenna stayed with friends for a few nights, but the paranoia followed her. She installed cameras, alarms, motion sensors, yet the scratching continued, recorded in the footage when she wasn't home, appearing only in the middle of the night, sometimes moving from room to room, always deliberate, always there. She became obsessed with patterns, studying every angle, every creak. It wasn't a person, she decided eventually, at least not in the conventional sense. Whoever, or whatever this was, it knew her routines, her fears, her habits. Weeks later, the pattern escalated. The noises weren't confined to the night anymore. Sometimes she would hear the faint click of a doorknob while she was cooking in the afternoon, or footsteps above her ceiling when she was taking a shower. One evening, she came home to find the living room rearranged. Chairs slightly askew, the couch cushions moved. Nothing valuable was taken, but it was an unmistakable message. Someone had been inside, and they had been watching, waiting. Jenna became increasingly isolated. She stopped inviting friends over, citing work schedules, stress, exhaustion. She couldn't explain the fear, the constant sensation of being observed, but it dominated her every waking moment. Marcus tried to convince her to move in with him temporarily, but she refused. She told herself she could reclaim her life, her apartment, her space. But deep down, she knew the invader was patient. They didn't need her to leave. They just needed her to feel trapped. One night, around 3 a.m, Jenna was woken by the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. She bolted upright in bed, eyes wide in the darkness. The door was slightly ajar, though she had locked it before going to sleep. Her breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. She reached for the bat under the bed and held it in front of her like a shield. A shadow fell across the threshold, and she froze, convinced she was about to face the intruder again. Instead, a note fluttered to the floor, sliding across the carpet like it had been tossed by an unseen hand. Jenna's hands shook as she picked it up. The words were scrawled in a jagged, almost childlike handwriting. "You can't leave. You'll see me soon." Panic surged through her. She called the police, but when they arrived, there was no one. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry beyond the note. After that night, Jenna installed a security system with live monitoring and cameras in every room. She armed herself with batons, pepper spray, knives, anything she could get her hands on. Still, every night she heard the faint scratching, the soft footfalls, the creak of a doorknob that shouldn't be moving. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of shadows on the walls, fleeting and insubstantial, but they left her stomach in knots. Months passed. Jenna's life became a cycle of work, sleep, and vigilance. She rarely ventured outside after dark, and when she did, she felt exposed, as if someone were following her, always just out of sight. She tried therapy, medication, even meditation, but nothing erased the fear. The invader had become more than a physical presence. It was a psychological one, embedding itself into every thought, every decision, every sleepless hour. One evening, while reviewing footage from the living room camera, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, in the corner of the frame, barely visible in the grainy night vision, was a figure crouched, watching her sleep. It wasn't moving. It didn't need to. Just being there, frozen in the dark, was enough to send a shiver through her spine. She enhanced the footage, zoomed in, adjusted the contrast, and there it was again, the tall, lanky silhouette, indistinct, yet undeniably human in shape. Jenna's hands shook as she scrolled through other cameras. There were countless instances of this figure appearing, standing at the window, crouched behind the door, peering from the closet. Always silent, always observing. She realized with horror that this had been going on for months, possibly longer. Every time she thought she was alone, every time she thought she was safe, the figure was there, watching, waiting. Sleep became impossible. Jenna stayed awake for nights, clutching the bat, scanning the apartment, checking every window, every door, every closet. She knew it wasn't a dream, wasn't paranoia in the ordinary sense. This was something real, something patient and methodical. Her friends began to avoid her calls, concerned for her sanity, but she didn't care. She couldn't risk their presence. She couldn't risk alerting the figure. Then, one night, she noticed a new pattern. The figure wasn't just in the apartment anymore. It appeared on the camera feed outside, standing at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the fence. Always in the same position, always watching. It didn't move, didn't approach, just waited. Jenna called the police, but by the time they arrived, it had vanished. She realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't a simple home invasion. This was an obsession. She wasn't just being watched inside her apartment. She was being stalked. Panic and exhaustion drove Jenna to a breaking point. She decided to leave, temporarily, just to clear her mind. She packed essentials, armed herself, and drove to a hotel several towns away. For the first night, she slept relatively peacefully, comforted by the thought of distance, of safety. But the next morning, when she checked her phone, a single message had appeared. No number, no sender, just words that made her stomach turn. "Nice of you to come out and visit. I see you." Jenna realized there was no escaping. The figure wasn't just in her apartment, wasn't just outside her window. It was everywhere, always, silently, patiently, waiting for the moment when she would let her guard down. The horror wasn't in an attack or a theft. It was in the omnipresence, the certainty that she was never alone, never safe, never free. She had no idea what it wanted, no idea why it had chosen her, and the thought of living a life constantly monitored, constantly hunted, was unbearable. Days turned into weeks. Jenna's hotel room felt like a prison, the walls closing in. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, couldn't think without imagining the figure lurking just beyond the door or in the shadows. She tried to call friends, police, anyone, but she felt the futility pressing down on her. This wasn't something that could be reported, captured, or reasoned with. It was patient. It was methodical. It was eternal. One night she awoke to a sound she had come to know all too well, a soft scratching, right outside the hotel room door. She froze, staring at the peephole, her heart hammering. The scratching continued, slow, deliberate. She reached for the bat she kept by the bed, but before she could move, a faint whisper reached her ears, a voice she didn't recognize, yet felt intimately terrifying. It's time. She bolted upright, her pulse deafening in her ears, and for the first time she felt the crushing inevitability of the horror. This wasn't just a home invasion, or a stalker, or a criminal. This was something patient, intelligent, and malevolent. Something that thrived on fear, on isolation, on the certainty that it could follow her anywhere, always. Jenna realized then that the figure would never leave her, that she could run, hide, even change her life entirely, but it would never stop watching, waiting, stalking, scratching at the edges of her existence until she was nothing but a shell of terror. And in that moment, Jenna understood the cruel truth. There was no escape. Not in the apartment, not in the hotel, not anywhere. The figure had claimed her life, her peace, her sanity. She was trapped in a living nightmare, and it had only just begun. Story the end. It was a Friday evening in late October, and the air had that crisp, almost electric quality that made the suburban streets feel deceptively calm. Emma Caldwell had just returned from work, her shift at the hospital dragging longer than she cared to admit. She parked her aging Honda in the driveway of the two-story house she'd bought just 6 months ago in a quiet neighborhood in Springfield, Illinois. The house was modest, built in the 1970s, with a small front porch, a well-maintained lawn, and enough privacy from the neighbors to make it feel like a sanctuary. Emma had been proud when she first moved in, proud of being a young woman on her own, proud of her little corner of the world. But tonight, something felt off, though she couldn't yet pinpoint what. The first clue was the mailbox. It sat slightly ajar, something she couldn't remember leaving that way. She shrugged it off, blaming the wind. The keys jingled in her hand as she approached the front door, but before she could reach for the handle, she noticed a shadow flicker across the window to the left of the porch. Her pulse quickened, but when she looked directly, there was nothing there. She told herself it was a trick of the streetlight, tired eyes playing games on her mind. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warmth of her home washing over her as she flicked on the hallway light. Everything seemed normal at first. The living room was just as she had left it that morning. The couch cushions slightly indented from the evening before, the coffee table neatly arranged with magazines, and the faint smell of her morning coffee lingering in the air. She set down her purse and coat, exhaling deeply, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. Then she noticed it, a small, almost imperceptible movement in the corner of her eye. Her heart skipped. She turned, and at first saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of the living room near the sliding glass doors that led to the backyard, a glint of metal caught the light. It was a knife lying on the floor, its edge catching the glow from the ceiling lamp. Emma froze. She didn't own a knife like that. She didn't even have a large kitchen knife that looked dangerous in that way. Her hands started to shake, and she slowly backed toward the kitchen phone. Before she could reach it, a noise came from upstairs, the softest creak of floorboards above her bedroom. She had been living alone in the house for half a year, and no one else had a key. The thought struck her like a physical blow. Someone was inside. She tried calling 911, but her fingers fumbled over the keypad, too slow and jittery to properly dial. The creaking upstairs grew louder, deliberate. It was not the house settling. This was movement, someone pacing. Emma grabbed a small hammer from the kitchen drawer, the only weapon she could find quickly, and crept toward the hallway, trying to make her way to the staircase without making a sound. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she realized she could hear faint whispers, too low to make out words, but unmistakably human. The first person she saw was a man. He came down the stairs slowly, wearing a dark hoodie and gloves, his face partially obscured by a ski mask. He carried a crowbar, and the look in his eyes was not of a casual thief. It was predatory. Emma's instinct to fight or flee warred within her. She gripped the hammer tighter, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow. The man's eyes locked on hers. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but filled with menace. I live here," she stammered, trying to sound confident, even though fear had made her voice tremble. The man didn't move immediately. He studied her, head tilting slightly, as if considering whether to strike. Then, suddenly, he lunged. Emma swung the hammer with all her strength, catching him on the shoulder. He grunted but didn't go down. Instead, he shoved her back, and she stumbled, crashing into the wall near the kitchen doorway. The hammer clattered to the floor. Emma scrambled, grabbing a heavy frying pan. She swung at him, connecting with his side, and he hissed in pain. He backed up, giving her a moment to flee toward the back door. But when she reached it, it was locked from the outside. Panic surged through her veins. The man's movements were quick now, calculated. He circled her like a predator, his gloved hands flexing, the crowbar still in one hand. "You're going to regret this," he said, stepping closer. Emma felt trapped. There was nowhere to go. The kitchen's layout a cage rather than a sanctuary. She noticed the sliding glass door and ran toward it, wrenching at the handle, praying it would open. The lock gave with a click, and she bolted into the backyard, adrenaline fueling her legs. The night air was cold and sharp in her lungs. She ran across the lawn, glancing over her shoulder to see the man emerge from the house, crowbar raised. He sprinted after her. Emma didn't stop, heading for the neighbor's house just 2 doors down. She pounded on the door, screaming for help. The neighbor, Mr. Hansen, an elderly man in his 70s, opened the door, startled. "Call 911, she shouted, breathless, eyes wide. Mr. Hansen grabbed the phone while Emma backed away, trying to keep sight of the intruder. The man didn't stop immediately. He seemed to hesitate, his gaze flicking between Emma and the door to Mr. Hansen's house. Then, realizing he wasn't getting what he wanted, he ran back toward the Caldwell house. Emma didn't wait. She stayed with Mr. Hansen, shaking that until the police arrived. When the officers entered the house, the scene was worse than Emma could have imagined. Drawers were pulled out, cabinets emptied, personal belongings scattered everywhere. It wasn't just a robbery. It was a methodical search, almost as if someone was looking for something specific. And then, in the master bedroom closet, they found it. A small handwritten notebook, its pages filled with disturbing sketches and notes about Emma, her daily routine and at work hours and habits. The man wasn't just a thief. He had been stalking her for weeks. The intruder, identified as Jason Cole, had a history of breaking into homes, but this one had escalated. The police revealed that he often targeted young women living alone, learning their routines, and planning attacks. Emma was lucky. She had managed to escape with her life. But the psychological scars ran deep. She stayed with her sister for weeks, unable to return to her home without trembling. The memory of that night burned into her mind. Weeks turned into months. Emma tried to reclaim her life, installing security cameras, reinforcing doors, and even taking self-defense classes. But every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of her eye, sent her heart racing. She knew that Cole had been caught, but the terror he had unleashed remained. One rainy evening, about 6 months later, Emma returned from work again. She had been trying to push past her fear, walking through the front door with a sense of routine, hoping familiarity would restore her peace. She turned the key, stepped inside, and froze. The mail was scattered across the floor, just as it had been on that first night. And then she heard it, a faint whisper from the stairs, so soft she thought she imagined it. Her pulse spiked, her hands gripping the railing as she ascended slowly, every sense alert. At the top of the stairs, a shadow moved just beyond the hallway light. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. But this time, she didn't run. She reached into her pocket and pressed the panic button on her security system. Within seconds, lights flickered on, alarms blaring, and a voice over the intercom warned that the police were on the way. The shadow disappeared instantly. Emma realized it had been a neighbor, a delivery person, nothing more sinister this time. But the fear lingered, the sense of vulnerability never fully leaving her. Every night, she double-checked locks, monitored cameras, and carried a heavy flashlight when walking through her own home. She had survived, yes, but survival came with a price, the lingering knowledge that the walls of her sanctuary could never truly protect her, that the shadow of danger could always return, silent and unseen. Months later, Emma finally felt a sliver of peace returning. Therapy, support from friends and family, and her own determination helped her regain a sense of control. Yet, on quiet nights, when the wind rattled the windows or the house creaked in its settling, she would freeze. remembering the glint of the crowbar, the glint of the knife, and the feeling of being utterly hunted. Emma knew that fear could be managed, but it could never be erased. The invader had left more than chaos and disorder. He had left a permanent mark on her sense of safety, a lesson in vulnerability that would stay with her forever. Even as she moved forward, even as she reclaimed her home, Emma never stopped watching the shadows, never stopped listening for footsteps that might not belong. The home invasion had been real, and it had changed everything. Her sanctuary would always hold memories of terror, but it would also hold her resilience, a testament to the fact that she had survived the nightmare when so many others might not have. The world outside might never be truly safe, but Emma had discovered something inside herself that no intruder could ever take away: the will to fight, to escape, and to keep living, no matter how close fear pressed against her. Years passed. Emma eventually moved to a different city, leaving the house in Springfield behind, hoping distance would help her heal further. But even in her new apartment, the memory lingered. Every unexpected knock, every shadow in the corner of her room brought her back to that night, back to the feeling of helplessness and raw terror. She had survived the home invasion, but its echo would follow her for the rest of her life. A haunting reminder that safety is fragile, and that sometimes the monsters don't live under the bed. They live next door, quietly waiting, silently watching, and biding their time. Story the end. It was late October when the Smith family first noticed something was off about their new home in suburban Ohio. They had just moved from Cleveland to a quiet cul-de-sac in a development that promised peace and safety. The house itself was older, a two-story colonial with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it had character, and the price had been right. David and Laura Smith had two children, Emily, 13, and Jake, 9. They had spent weeks unpacking, turning the house into a home, and enjoying the sense of space after their cramped apartment. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. Neighbors waved as they walked by, the streets were quiet at night, and the kids settled into their new rooms without complaint. The first incident occurred one Friday evening. David had stayed late at work, and Laura was alone, preparing dinner. She heard the sound of a door opening upstairs. At first, she thought Emily or Jake had wandered around, but when she called out, there was no response. Assuming it was just her imagination, she shook her head and went back to chopping vegetables. Then she heard it again, softer this time, a floorboard creaking as if someone were pacing deliberately. Her stomach tightened. She grabbed the kitchen knife, more out of instinct than expectation, and quietly ascended the stairs. The upstairs hallway was empty. The bedrooms were all locked or occupied. The kids were in their rooms. David's office was shut. Nothing appeared disturbed, but she noticed something odd. The window in Emily's room, which she was sure had been latched, was slightly ajar. A chill ran through her as she closed it and double-checked all the locks. She told herself it was probably just the wind. That night, she had trouble sleeping, constantly imagining shadows moving in the corners of the room. David returned late that night, and she reluctantly told him what had happened. He laughed nervously, suggesting it was nothing. A settling house, maybe a draft. "We'll check the security system tomorrow," he promised. They had installed a basic alarm, mostly for peace of mind, but it hadn't yet been activated. Over the next week, the strange occurrences escalated. Laura would hear muffled noises from the attic, even though the door was locked. Items in the kitchen would be slightly moved, silverware shifted, a cutting board displaced, things that could be explained away if one wasn't looking closely. Emily complained that her dolls would sometimes be in different positions, and Jake said he had heard someone whisper his name in the middle of the night. David began to notice that his laptop, which he kept in his office, had been turned on and positioned differently, although he was sure he had shut it down. One evening, while Laura was cleaning the basement, she saw a shadow flicker across the corner of the room. It moved quickly, like it had no weight. She froze, listening, but the only sound was the hum of the furnace. She called David, her voice shaky, and he came down, rolling his eyes. "Probably just your imagination," he said, but he stayed with her for a few minutes before retreating upstairs. By the second week of November, the tension had grown unbearable. David and Laura began sleeping with a baseball bat next to the bed, doors locked, windows double-checked. The children were anxious, jumping at every creak. The neighbors, when asked, assured them the neighborhood had a low crime rate. "You're probably just getting used to a new place," one kindly neighbor had said. But David and Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. The turning point came one Thursday night. David was working late again, and Laura had put the kids to bed. Around midnight, she was woken by a loud bang in the living room, like something heavy had been thrown against the wall. She froze, her heart hammering. The house was dark except for the faint glow from the streetlights outside. The sound came again, this time followed by the unmistakable click of a door handle. Laura grabbed the bat and crept downstairs. The front door was locked, but the glass panels beside it were cracked, spiderwebbed out as if something had slammed against them. Then she saw it, a figure crouched near the base of the stairs, moving slowly, deliberately. She screamed, and the figure froze. Laura's voice shook as she shouted for David, but there was no answer. The intruder bolted toward the kitchen, and she swung the bat with all her strength. She connected with the shoulder of the man, and he let out a strangled yell before sprinting toward the back door. She chased him, but he was gone, leaving only a muddy footprint trail outside in the damp October night. The police arrived quickly after David returned, alerted by a panicked neighbor who had heard the commotion. They took statements, dusted for prints, and assured the family that this was likely an isolated incident. But Laura knew better. She had seen the intent in the man's eyes, a cold calculation that chilled her to the bone. In the weeks that followed, the home invasion was not an isolated event. The Smiths installed a full security system, cameras in every room, motion detectors, everything the police recommended. Yet the feeling never left. Cameras would sometimes show nothing when a noise was heard, and occasionally a shadow would move across the hallway. Emily began sleeping with her door locked and lights on, and Jake refused to go into the basement alone. David started taking a night shift at work so someone would always be home. One night, Laura was woken by her phone buzzing incessantly. A text from an unknown number, "I see you." Her stomach knotted. She tried to call David, but the line was dead. She grabbed her bat and cautiously moved through the house. Nothing. The kids were asleep. The only thing she could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator and her own panicked breathing. Then another text came. "They are watching." By this point, the family was on edge constantly. Every knock, every creak, every flicker of the lights sent them into panic. They rarely left the house at night, and even during the day, Laura would constantly look out the windows. David tried to reassure her, but he was increasingly irritable, stressed by the constant fear. It was on a rainy Saturday in December that the final confrontation occurred. The family had gone to a local market in the afternoon, leaving the security system armed and cameras recording. When they returned around 7 p.m., the front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. David's stomach sank. He motioned for the kids to stay in the car while he and Laura approached. Inside, the house was in disarray. Drawers pulled out, cabinets open, the furniture overturned. But what froze David and Laura in place were the words smeared across the living room wall in red paint. "I know where you sleep." They called the police, who arrived within minutes. This time, there was no one in the house, no prints beyond the obvious muddy footprints leading from the back door to the woods behind the property. The officers recommended staying elsewhere, at least until the intruder was caught. The Smiths reluctantly agreed and checked into a hotel for the night. The next morning, the lead detective informed them that the pattern of the intrusion suggested a single methodical perpetrator, someone who had been watching them for weeks. The children had been at risk during the previous incidents, he warned, and the family was lucky to have avoided physical harm. Yet despite the investigation, no suspect was ever identified, and the case went cold. The Smiths eventually returned to the house, determined not to be driven away, but life was never the same. They installed reinforced doors, motion-sensitive lights, surveillance cameras with remote access, and even a panic room in the basement. They carried firearms, underwent self-defense training, and changed routines to avoid predictability. Yet the anxiety never fully lifted. Every noise, every shadow, every unfamiliar movement outside their home triggered a primal fear, A memory of the man crouched at the base of the stairs, the malicious intent in his eyes, and the haunting texts on Laura's phone. The children, now older, would sometimes ask if they were really safe. Laura would hug them tightly, assuring them, but deep down, she knew that once fear like that has invaded a home, it leaves a residue. The Smiths learned to live with it, a constant tension beneath the surface of daily life, a shadow that followed them no matter where they went in the house. Years passed. The neighborhood remained quiet, suburban normal, but the Smiths never fully relaxed. They had friends over only occasionally, always alert, always aware. On Halloween, when children came to the door, Emily and Jake, now teenagers, would close the blinds and lock the doors before opening them just slightly to hand out candy. The house had been transformed into a fortress, a place of survival rather than a home of comfort. Even now, late at night, when the wind rattles the windows and the house creaks, Laura sometimes wakes with a start, thinking she hears footsteps upstairs. She knows it's probably nothing, settling floors, the wind, but a cold sweat breaks out across her back. In those moments, she remembers the night the man crouched at the bottom of the stairs, the bat in her hand, the fear so palpable it felt like it could choke her. She remembers the text on her phone and the red letters smeared across the wall, and she knows that the sense of being watched is never really gone. David sleeps fitfully, dream fragments of intruders and broken windows haunting him. Emily sleeps with a baseball bat under her bed, and Jake refuses to let his bedroom door be closed when he's alone. The Smiths have become hyper-aware, over-prepared, always scanning, always checking. They have learned the hard way that home is supposed to be a place of safety, but once violated, safety becomes an illusion. And some nights when the house is quiet and the shadows stretch long across the walls, they feel that old familiar dread creeping back, reminding them that they were never truly alone. Even with all the measures, they know the truth. Someone had once breached the sanctity of their home with methodical precision, and the memory of that fear is permanent. The house itself carries an energy now, a subtle tension that seems to whisper reminders of what happened. A flickering light, a misplaced item, a floorboard that groans too loudly, each becomes a trigger, a silent echo of that invasion, a reminder that the past can reach into the present without warning. The Smiths' story became something of a quiet warning among their friends and neighbors. Casual advice about locks and alarms didn't capture the full experience. The psychological scar, the constant awareness that a home, no matter how secure, is only as safe as the vigilance of those inside. Over time, other families moved in and out of the neighborhood, oblivious to the invisible mark left by one night of terror. But for the Smiths, every creak in the floor, every shadow in a hallway, and every unfamiliar noise in the dead of night was a visceral reminder of what had happened and what could happen again. Years later, when David and Laura were old enough to retire and move to a quieter town, they often spoke about leaving, about getting away from the memories embedded in the house. Yet, even as they drove away, they could feel the lingering unease, the idea that home had been violated in a way that nothing could ever fully repair. The psychological imprint, the terror, the feeling of being watched had taken root permanently. And so the house stood, quiet from the outside, normal looking to any passerby, but within its walls it held memories of fear, intrusion, and vulnerability. It became a monument to the fragility of safety, a reminder that home invasion is not just about physical theft, it's about taking the sense of security, the intangible piece that makes a place a home, and shattering it completely. For the Smiths, and perhaps for anyone who might live there in the future, the house would never feel entirely safe again. Story the end.